At our 30th wedding anniversary, my husband asked every guest to stand and welcome his pregnant mistress as the new Mrs. Carter. Half the ballroom refused to applaud. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the humidity before a coastal storm. It pressed against the gold leaf molding of the Fairmont ballroom and settled into the silk of my midnight blue gown. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I simply kept my hand resting on the stem of my champagne flute, watching the man I had spent 3 decades building into a king. Elias Vance Carter stood on the small riser, the spotlight catching the silver at his temples and the sharp, arrogant line of his tuxedo. He looked powerful. He looked triumphant. And beside him, draped in a shimmering champagne silk that clung to the slight, undeniable curve of her stomach, stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 25. "I know this is a surprise," Elias said, his voice amplified by the microphone, smooth as a 20-year-old Scotch. "But after 30 years of duty, I've decided it's time for the world to see the woman who has truly captured my heart. Jada is the future. She's the legacy. And she's carrying the son I was always promised." He didn't look at me. Not once. He looked out over the sea of our friends, our business partners, our church deacons, and our 3 adult children sitting at the front table. Beside me, my eldest daughter, Naomi, let out a sound, a sharp, ragged intake of breath that sounded like a physical wound. My son Marcus began to stand, his face darkening with a fury I had only ever seen in his father, but I reached out. I didn't look at him. I simply placed my hand on his forearm. My grip was steel. I felt the vibration of his rage, but I squeezed until he slowly, shakily, lowered himself back into the mahogany chair. "Not here," I whispered. My voice was a ghost, yet it carried the weight of a command. "Not now." Elias was still smiling, waiting for the roar of approval he had been conditioned to expect. He was the man who had brought a Fortune 500 logistics firm to this city. He was the man who had donated the wing to the children's hospital. He was the man everyone wanted to be, or be near. He expected the room to bend to his will just as it always had. But the room was fractured. To my left, the old guard, the women I had served on boards with, the deacons who knew how many times I had quietly covered the church's mortgage, the business partners who knew I was the one who actually read the contracts Elias signed, stayed seated. They sat like statues carved from mahogany and grit. Their faces were masks of refined, icy disapproval. To my right, the younger crowd, the climbers who wanted Elias's favor, were fluttering. A few clapped tentatively, their eyes darting around to see if they were committing social suicide. The sound was thin and pathetic, like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. Before we continue, let me know what you would have done in my place. If you were sitting at a table you paid for, celebrating a life you built, and were publicly replaced in the middle of the toast, would you have walked out or stayed to see it through? Let me know in the comments. It always amazes me to see how many people have faced these moments of quiet betrayal. Elias's smile faltered for the briefest of seconds. He hadn't expected the resistance. He looked down at Jada, who was now beginning to look small. The new Mrs. Carter was realizing that the title didn't come just from a man. It came from the community that had spent 30 years watching the woman she was trying to replace. I felt the heat of 100 stares turning toward me. They were looking for the angry black woman. They were waiting for me to stand up and scream, to snatch the microphone, to throw the champagne, to provide the entertainment for the evening. They wanted a show. They wanted a breakdown. I gave them neither. I stood up. I did it slowly, my back straight, my chin level. I am 5'9", and in my heels, I looked Elias directly in the eye across the expanse of the ballroom. I didn't look at the girl. To look at her would be to acknowledge her as a threat, and I have never been threatened by something I could buy and sell twice over. The room went deathly silent. Even the tentative clappers stopped. I picked up my glass. The bubbles were still rising, tiny and persistent. "Elias," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but I had spent 20 years as a lead administrator for the city's largest surgical center. I knew how to project into a room without ever raising my volume. "A toast." Elias froze. His hand tightened around Jada's waist. He looked for a moment like a boy who had been caught playing in his father's shoes. "To 30 years," I said, my gaze never wavering. "To the foundations we build, and the wisdom to know when the structure has become termite-ridden and hollow. You ask this room to welcome a new Mrs. Carter. I, for one, am happy to hand over the keys, because if there is one thing I have learned in 3 decades of maintaining this estate, it's that some burdens are far too heavy to be called blessings anymore." I tipped my glass toward him, a sharp, elegant salute. Then, I didn't drink. I walked to the edge of the table, and with a precision that felt like a surgical strike, I set the full glass down on the white linen. I turned to my children. "Children, stay. Finish your dinner. The salmon is excellent, and I've already paid the catering bill." "Ma," Marcus started, his voice cracking. "Stay," I repeated. It wasn't a request. I turned and began to walk toward the exit. The walk felt like it lasted a century. Every step was a click on the marble. I passed the table of the mayor, who looked at me with a pained, deep respect. I passed the table of my sisters-in-law, who were looking at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the woman who had bailed their brothers out of jail and paid for their mother's funerals. I reached the double doors. The valet was already there, holding my keys. He had worked for us for years. He didn't say a word, but he handed me the fob to my Mercedes with a look that suggested he would have driven me off a cliff if I'd asked him to, just to get me away from that room. I stepped out into the cool Richmond air. The city smelled of rain and exhaust. I didn't get into the car. Not yet. I walked to the edge of the fountain in the circular driveway. I reached into my small beaded clutch and pulled out my phone. There was a notification. A single text from an unsaved number. "The transfer is complete, Seraphina. He won't see it until Monday morning. Happy anniversary." I deleted the message. For 30 years, I had been the strong Black woman. I had been the backbone. I had been the silent partner who did the taxes, managed the property, smoothed over the misunderstandings with his secretaries, and made sure his shirts were pressed and his ego was fed. I had been the foundation Elias Carter built his empire on, and I knew something he had forgotten. When you remove the foundation, the empire doesn't just change owners. It collapses. I looked back at the glowing windows of the ballroom. I could see the silhouettes of the guests through the frosted glass. Inside, Elias was likely trying to salvage the night, trying to force a celebration that had turned into a wake. He thought he had humiliated me. He thought he had traded an old model for a new one. He didn't realize that I had spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment. I hadn't been blind to Jada. I hadn't been blind to the jewelry missing from the safe or the business trips to Miami. I had simply been quiet. I got into my car, the leather cool and smelling of the expensive jasmine perfume I'd worn for him for 20 years. I started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw a figure running toward the car in the rearview mirror. It was Elias. He was shouting something, his face contorted, his tuxedo jacket flapping in the wind. He looked small. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd thrown a match into the only room that kept him warm. I didn't tap the brakes. I didn't look back. I had a townhouse in Charleston that he didn't know about, a bank account in my maiden name that had been growing for 3 years, and a heart that was finally, for the first time in my adult life, no longer on the clock. The new Mrs. Carter could have the name. I was taking the life. The drive from the Fairmont to the city limits of Richmond was the quietest 20 minutes of my life. In the modern world, silence is a luxury most people can't afford. We fill our lives with the hum of refrigerators, the ping of notifications, and the constant internal monologue of our own anxieties. But as I steered the Mercedes through the rain-slicked streets, the silence was absolute. It wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It was the silence of a vault closing. I watched the city lights blur in the side mirror, the neon signs of the revitalized downtown, the glowing clock tower of the old train station, the shadows of the monuments that lined the avenues. For 30 years, I had been the silent cartographer of this city's social and financial geography. I knew whose marriages were failing by the way they sat at charity galas. I knew which businesses were overextended by the tension in their CEOs' handshakes. And I knew exactly how much Elias Vance Carter was worth, down to the penny and down to the soul. My phone, resting in the center console, began to vibrate. It didn't ring. I had silenced the ringer months ago, anticipating the deluge. Naomi, Marcus, Elias, 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 Evelyn, Elias's mother. I didn't answer. To answer was to engage in their narrative, and I was busy finishing my own. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy, a bright, sterile island in the middle of the dark. I didn't need medicine. I needed a moment to look at my own face in a mirror that wasn't framed in gold leaf. I flipped down the sun visor and caught my reflection. My makeup was still perfect. My hair, a silver-streaked bob that cost more than some people's monthly rent, wasn't out of place. My eyes, however, were different. They looked like the eyes of a woman who had finally stepped out of a burning building and realized she hadn't even singed her eyebrows. For years, I had been told I was unbreakable. Seraphina is the rock, Elias would tell his partners over expensive steaks. She's the one who keeps the trains running on time. I'm the engine, but she's the tracks. It was meant as a compliment, but it was a cage. When people call you a rock, they stop thinking you can feel the weather. They think they can kick you, spit on you, or build a monument on top of you and you'll just stay there. Because that's what rocks do. They don't move. They don't hurt. They just endure. I thought about the engine. Elias was a man of grand gestures and shallow depths. He loved the theater of power, the way people stood when he entered a room, the way his name looked on a building, the way a younger woman looked on his arm. He thought power was something you took. He didn't realize that true power is something you grant. I had granted him his status. I was the one who had spent the late nights in the early 90s doing the books for his fledgling trucking company while he slept. I was the one who had navigated the politics of the country club when they didn't want a black family on the roster, smiling and nodding and playing the perfect wife until they had no choice but to let us in. I was the one who had managed his reputation, hiding his drinking in the early 2000s and his temporary lapses in judgment with various receptionists. I had been the architect of the great Elias Carter, and tonight he had tried to evict the architect from the building. The phone vibrated again. A text message from Marcus, my son, the one who took most after me. "Ma, where are you? He's gone crazy. He's trying to kick us out of the ballroom because Naomi called that girl a rented vessel. The police are here. Please call me." I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. A rented vessel. Naomi always did have a way with words. She was a lawyer, trained to find the most precise way to inflict a wound. But I wasn't going back to fix it. I wasn't going back to mediate. I shifted the car into gear and kept driving. I didn't go to the house, the 12,000 square foot Georgian manor in Libby Hill that we called the Carter Estate. I knew Elias would head there eventually, Jada in tow, thinking he had won the war because he still held the castle. Instead, I drove toward the north side, to a small, unassuming brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was the house my grandmother had left me. Elias had wanted me to sell it years ago, calling it a liability and an eyesore. I had told him I'd sold it. In reality, I'd spent the last 3 years meticulously restoring it, using a small private inheritance from my aunt and the management fees I'd quietly diverted from our joint property holdings. I pulled into the narrow driveway. The house was dark, but the porch light was on, a warm amber glow that felt like a hug. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the rain hit the windshield. The Monday morning transfer. Elias thought he was the majority shareholder of Carter Logistics. He thought he owned the majority stake in the North Carolina warehouses. He thought the offshore account in the Cayman Islands was his secret safety net for his new life with Jada and the heir. He was wrong. Elias is a man who signs papers without reading the fine print if the person handing him the pen is someone he trusts, or someone he views as an extension of himself. Over the last 5 years, as his interest in the business of marriage waned and his interest in extracurriculars grew, he had signed dozens of documents: power of attorney updates, corporate restructuring papers, trust modifications. He thought he was signing papers to minimize our tax liability. In reality, he was signing the slow, legal dissolution of his own empire. Every time he'd come home late, smelling of a perfume I didn't own, I'd hand him a folder the next morning with his coffee. "Just some clerical stuff for the board, Elias. I need your signature before the 10 o'clock meeting." "You're a lifesaver, Sarah," he'd say, scrawling his bold, arrogant signature across the bottom of a page that moved another 2% of the company into a blind trust for our children, controlled solely by me. By the time he woke up on Monday morning and tried to access the corporate accounts to pay for Jada's new push gift or the down payment on the condo he'd promised her, he would find that his digital keys no longer worked. He would find that he was a figurehead with a fancy office and a very expensive car, but no actual capital. I stepped out of the Mercedes, my silk heels sinking slightly into the wet grass. I didn't care about the shoes. I walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door. The house smelled of cedar, old books, and the lavender sachet I'd left on the hallway table. It was small. It was humble. And it was entirely, legally, and spiritually mine. I went into the kitchen and put on the kettle. I moved with a deliberate slowness. For 30 years, I had moved with urgency. I had moved to the rhythm of his needs, the children's schedules, the community's expectations. Now, I moved for the sake of the movement itself. I sat at the small oak table, the same one my grandmother had used to roll out biscuit dough. The phone on the counter lit up again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a video file sent by a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Then, I tapped it. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, likely by a disgruntled waiter or a curious guest. It was the ballroom, 10 minutes after I had walked out. The new Mrs. Carter was standing on the riser, crying. Not a dignified cry, but the messy, panicked sob of a girl who realized the fairy tale had just turned into a documentary. Elias was standing in the middle of the floor, screaming at Marcus. "You think you're so smart?" Elias's voice was distorted by the phone's mic, but the venom was clear. "Everything you have, I gave you. Your car, your house, your fancy degree. I built this. And if your mother wants to walk away, she walks away with nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." Marcus didn't scream back. He just looked at his father with a pity that was more devastating than any insult. "Dad," Marcus said, and even in the grainy video, his voice sounded tired. "You really don't get it, do you? You didn't build this. You were just the one standing in front of the camera while Mom built the set." The video cut off. I set the phone down. A coldness began to spread through my chest, not the coldness of sorrow, but the coldness of a long-delayed realization. I had raised my children well, but I had also raised them in a house where they watched their mother be a servant in a crown. They knew. They had always known. And they had stayed silent too, enjoying the fruits of the labor while watching the labor kill me. I looked around the small kitchen. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of Elias. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of Marcus or the sharp rap of Naomi. It was 3 slow, heavy thuds. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs for the first time that night. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on the porch, drenched in the rain, was Evelyn, Elias's mother, the woman who had taught me how to make the very biscuits I used to serve her son, the woman who had always told me that a woman's strength is her silence. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the Mercedes in the driveway. I opened the door. Evelyn didn't move. She was 82 years old, her skin like fine, dark parchment, her eyes clouded with cataracts but sharp with an ancient intelligence. She was holding a heavy, leather-bound book to her chest, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep it dry. "He's a fool, Seraphina," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. "He always was. He thinks he's the king because he's got the scepter, but he forgot who owns the land." "Evelyn," I said, stepping back to let her in. "What are you doing here? You should be at the hotel." "I'm not going back to that hotel," she said, stepping into the hallway and shaking the water from her plastic-wrapped bundle. "And I'm not going back to that house he bought me. If you're leaving him, you're taking me with you." She held out the leather-bound book. "You're going to need this," she said. "It's the ledger, the real one, the one my husband kept before Elias took over, the one that shows where the first $100,000 came from, the money Elias told you he earned from that first contract." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "What do you mean, Evelyn?" She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of shame in those old eyes. "Elias didn't earn that money, Seraphina. He took it. and he took it from someone you know very, very well. The ledger sat on the oak table between us, a heavy leather-bound ghost. The plastic bag Evelyn had used to protect it from the rain lay discarded on the floor like a shed skin. Outside, the Richmond rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window pane, a sound that usually soothed me. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. I didn't open the book immediately. I looked at Evelyn's hands, those gnarled, beautiful hands that had picked cotton in her youth and then spent 40 years typing legal briefs for a firm that never made her a partner. Those hands were trembling. "My father," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Arthur Robinson. What does he have to do with Elias's first contract?" Evelyn leaned back, her wet coat still clinging to her shoulders. I reached over and began to unbutton it, moving with the practiced care of a daughter. I hung the coat over the back of a chair and brought her a warm towel. We didn't speak for a few minutes. In our culture, the heavy truths are never served cold. They need to sit, to breathe, to be cushioned by a bit of comfort. "You remember the winter of '94? Evelyn finally asked, her voice sounding like dry leaves scuttering across a porch. "Arthur had just been diagnosed with lung cancer. He was worried about your mama. He'd been working that job at the shipyard for 35 years, and he had that pension and the life insurance policy he'd been paying into since the day you were born." I nodded. I remembered that winter clearly. It was the year Elias and I were trying to buy our first 3 trucks. We were living in a 2-bedroom apartment, Marcus was a toddler, and I was pregnant with Naomi. We were broke, but Elias was full of fire. He told me he'd found an investor, a silent partner who believed in his vision. "Arthur didn't give Elias that money, Seraphina," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on the ledger. "He didn't invest in those trucks. He didn't even know Elias had the money." "Then where did it come from?" "Elias was the one who helped your daddy with his paperwork," she said. "Remember? Arthur trusted him. He thought Elias was the smart one with the college degree. He signed those papers thinking he was setting up a trust for your mama. But Elias, he shifted the beneficiary. He forged a document that collateralized your father's entire pension and his life insurance settlement against a business loan." I felt a coldness settle into my marrow. The investor wasn't a person. It was my father's life. "Arthur died thinking the money was safe," Evelyn whispered, a tear finally escaping her clouded eyes. "And when the insurance company sent the payout, it didn't go to your mama. It went to a holding company Elias had set up 6 months prior. That's how he bought the first fleet. That's how he got the contract with the state. He built this empire on the theft of your mother's security. Your mama spent her final years in that tiny apartment over the grocery store because she thought the market had crashed her savings. Elias lied to her face every Sunday at dinner for 10 years. I stood up so abruptly the chair screeched against the floor. The room felt small. The walls of the house I had loved, the house my grandmother had left me, felt like they were closing in. For 30 years, I had defended Elias. I had told myself he was a flawed man, a difficult man, but a man of integrity when it came to his family. I had told our children that their father was a self-made titan, a lion who had fought the world to give them a kingdom. And all the while, he had been a scavenger. He hadn't fought the world. He had robbed an old man on his deathbed. He had robbed my father. I reached for the ledger and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, filled with the precise, cramped handwriting of Evelyn's late husband, who had been Elias's bookkeeper in the early days, before Elias grew the company and hired a big firm to hide the bodies. There it was, December 12th, 1994. Transfer $142,000. Source: Robinson Estate/AIG Settlement. Note: Startup Capital, Fleet Alpha. I closed my eyes. I could see my father's face, his dark, weathered skin, the way he smelled of sawdust and Old Spice. I remembered how he looked at Elias with such pride, calling him son, thinking his daughter had married a man who would protect her. Elias hadn't protected me. He had harvested me. "Why are you telling me this now, Evelyn?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Why tonight?" Evelyn reached out and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Because for 30 years, I watched you carry him. I watched you fix what he broke. I watched you dim your light so he could pretend he was the sun. I stayed quiet because I was ashamed of the man I raised. I thought if he became successful enough, if he did enough good with the money, it would make up for the sin. But tonight," she trailed off, her lip trembling. "Tonight, when he stood on that stage with that girl, when he called her the new Mrs. Carter and insulted the woman who actually made him, I realized that a man who starts with a theft will end with a betrayal. There is no good in him, Seraphina. He's just a hollow suit. And I won't let him take anything else from you." My phone vibrated on the table. It was a notification from the security system at the Libby Hill estate. The front door had been opened. Then, a text from Naomi. "Ma, he's at the house. He brought her there. He's throwing your things into the hallway. Marcus is trying to stop him, but the police are back. He's telling them you abandoned the property. Ma, please, you have to come back." I looked at the text. I looked at the ledger. I looked at Evelyn. In that moment, the strong black woman who had spent 30 years de-escalating, mediating, and protecting the Carter image died. She didn't die of a broken heart. She died of a cleared vision. I wasn't going back to that house to beg for my clothes. I wasn't going back to argue about who owned the furniture. "Evelyn," I said, picking up my phone, "can you stay here? There's food in the fridge and the guest room is made up." "Where are you going, Seraphina?" "I'm going to do something I should have done in 1994, I said. "I'm going to audit the king." I didn't call Naomi back. Instead, I dialed the number I had saved under HVAC repair 3 years ago. It rang twice. "Hello, Seraphina," a deep professional voice answered. It was Julian Vane, the most aggressive forensic accountant in the state of Virginia, a man Elias had once called a bloodhound in a pinstripe suit. "Julian," I said, my voice steady, "I hope you're awake. I have the ledger." There was a pause on the other end. "The 1994 book? The one we couldn't find in the digital discovery?" "It's in my hands, and I have the original beneficiary transfer discretion for the Robinson estate." "Seraphina," Julian said, and I could hear him shifting in his chair, the sound of a predator sensing a kill. "If you have those, and you file for the emergency injunction tonight, we don't just freeze the corporate accounts. We move for a criminal referral for insurance fraud and embezzlement. It won't just be a divorce. It'll be an eviction from his entire life." "How fast can you file?" "For you, I'll have the digital filing in the judge's queue before the sun comes up. But you need to understand something. Once we pull this thread, the whole tapestry comes apart. The company, the reputation, The house in Libby Hill? It all becomes evidence. You'll be taking him down, but you'll be standing in the blast zone. I looked out the window. The rain was stopping, the clouds breaking to reveal a sliver of a cold, indifferent moon. I've spent 30 years building a house for a thief, Julian, I said. I'm not worried about the blast zone. I'm worried about the debris hitting my children. Prepare the filings. And Julian? Yes? Add a clause for the immediate seizure of the Libby Hill property. I want the new Mrs. Carter to understand exactly what kind of foundation she's standing on. I hung up. I turned to Evelyn. You should get some sleep. What about you? She asked. I have a board meeting to prepare for, I said, and Elias has a very early wake-up call. I sat down at the small oak table. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply opened my laptop and began the systematic process of disconnecting my life from his. I started with the joint credit cards. One by one, I reported them as potential fraud and requested immediate freezes. Then, I accessed the management portal for the Carter logistics server. Elias was a man of habit. His password had been the same for 15 years, his wedding anniversary, 061494. I typed the numbers in. Access denied. I blinked. I tried again. Access denied. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Elias was many things, but he wasn't tech-savvy. He didn't change passwords. He didn't even know how to set up his own voicemail. I tried a third time, my fingers hovering over the keys. Suddenly, the screen on my laptop flickered. A window popped up. It wasn't a system error. It was a chat window. Did you really think I hadn't noticed the management fees, Seraphina? My heart stopped. The text continued to scroll. I've known about the Northside house for 18 months. I've known about Julian Vane for 6. You've been a very busy woman, my dear. But you forgot one thing. I'm the one who hired the IT director, and he works for me, not the foundation. The screen went black. Then a single line of text appeared in bright, mocking red. Check the news. Your reclamation just hit a snag. I lunged for the television in the small living room, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the remote. I flipped to the local 24-hour news cycle. The headline at the bottom of the screen made the room spin. Breaking. Financial discrepancies discovered at Carter Logistics. Co-Seraphina Carter named as primary person of interest in multi-million-dollar embezzlement probe. A photo of me, the one from last year's Woman of the Year gala, filled the screen. Elias wasn't just replacing me. He was framing me. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, turning onto the quiet north side street. They weren't coming for the man who stole from my father. They were coming for me. The blue and red lights did not dance. They pulsed. They turned the white painted bricks of my grandmother's house into a rhythmic, bleeding heart. Through the thin lace curtains of the front window, I watched the shadows of 2 officers lengthen across the lawn, the same lawn I had spent the previous Saturday morning weeding in a pair of old gardening gloves, seeking a piece that had already been stolen from me. I looked at the ledger on the table. It was the only weapon I had left that wasn't digital, which meant it was the only one Elias couldn't delete. "Seraphina," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here." "I know." I walked to the kitchen counter. I didn't run. I didn't scramble. I picked up my pearl earrings from where I'd left them by the sink and clipped them back onto my lobes. I smoothed the midnight silk of my gown. I looked at the ledger, then at the small, narrow space beneath the old cast-iron radiator in the corner of the dining room. It was a dusty, forgotten gap, but it was just wide enough. I slid the book into the shadows. A heavy knock echoed through the house. 3 raps. Professional. Final. Seraphina Carter, this is Detective Holloway with the Richmond Police Department. We have a warrant for your questioning and a search order for the premises. I walked to the door and opened it. The air was cold and smelled of wet asphalt. Detective Holloway was a man I knew. I had sat next to his wife at the mayor's prayer breakfast for 3 years running. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the flicker of apology in his eyes before he hardened his expression into the mask of the law. "Good evening, Detective," I said. My voice was like a calm lake. "I assume my husband has been very busy this evening." "Mrs. Carter," Holloway said, stepping into the hallway. 2 uniformed officers followed him, their boots loud and disrespectful on the hardwood. "There are some serious allegations regarding the diversion of corporate funds into private accounts. We have a digital trail that points directly to your personal device." "A digital trail," I repeated. "And I suppose that trail started moving about 45 minutes ago?" "The investigation has been ongoing for weeks, ma'am," Holloway replied. "According to the evidence provided by Carter Logistics security firm, you've been transferring large sums to a shell company, Robinson Holdings, for over 18 months. That, combined with the house you're standing in, which wasn't disclosed in your joint filings—" He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. To the world, the story was perfect. The long-suffering wife finds out about the younger woman, feels her status slipping, and decides to rob the vault on her way out the door. It was a cliché. It was a "scorned woman" headline. It was exactly the kind of mess people expected from a public breakdown. "I haven't been stealing, Detective," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I've been reclaiming. But I'm sure the nuance will be lost on the magistrate." "Seraphina!" Evelyn stepped into the hall, her eyes wide. Tell them about the ledger. Tell them about what Elias did to Arthur." I caught Evelyn's gaze. I gave her a look, the one I used when the children were small and the world was getting too loud. It was a look that commanded silence for the sake of survival. If I told them about the ledger now, it would be confiscated as evidence. In Elias's world, evidence had a habit of disappearing from police lockers or being misplaced during processing. "Evelyn, please," I said softly, "go to the kitchen. Call my daughter. Tell her I'm going downtown to clear up a misunderstanding." Holloway moved toward me with the handcuffs. He didn't want to use them, I could tell. He hesitated, the metal clinking in the quiet air. "Is that necessary, David?" I asked, using his first name for the first and only time. "I am in a $4,000 gown. I am 60 years old. I am not a flight risk. I am a woman who has lived in this city her entire life. I will walk to your car, and I will sit in the back, but I will not be paraded through this neighborhood in irons." Holloway looked at the uniformed officers, then back at me. He slowly tucked the cuffs back into his belt. "Let's go, Mrs. Carter." Quietly. I turned to Evelyn one last time. "Don't let anyone in this house but Naomi. Do you understand? No one." As I walked down the porch steps, the neighbors' lights were beginning to flick on. Curtains were twitching. I could feel the collective gasp of the street. The great Seraphina Carter being taken away in the middle of the night. They would talk. They would wonder. They would judge. And I realized, as the cold leather of the patrol car's back seat pressed against my skin, that I didn't care. For 30 years, my entire identity had been built on what these people thought of me. Tonight, that cage had finally rusted through. We arrived at the precinct, a place of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. I was processed like any other person of interest. I sat in a small, windowless room, my silk dress a jarring splash of elegance against the gray cinder block walls. 2 hours passed. The door opened, and it wasn't Holloway who walked in. It was Elias. He was still in his tuxedo, though he'd removed his bow tie. He looked exhausted, the grieving husband mask firmly in place. He carried a paper cup of water and set it on the table in front of me. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with a fake, practiced sorrow. "Why? If you wanted a divorce, we could have talked. You didn't have to ruin everything. You didn't have to steal from the employees' pension fund." I didn't touch the water. I didn't even look at him. I looked at the wall behind him. "The pension fund?" I whispered. "That's a new touch, Elias. I thought it was just the Robinson Holdings accounts." "The investigators found everything, Sarah. The IT director, he's devastated. He thought of you like a mother. To find out you were using his credentials to bypass the encryption?" He sighed, leaning forward. "They're talking about 10 to 15 years. At your age, well, it's a life sentence." I finally turned my head to look at him. Up close, I could see the tiny tremors in his hands. He wasn't triumphant. He was terrified. He was overacting because he knew the foundation was gone, and he was trying to build a new one out of lies before the roof collapsed. 10 to 15 years, I said. "And I suppose all of this goes away if I sign a very specific set of papers? A full confession in exchange for a suspended sentence? A waiver of all marital assets? A non-disclosure agreement that keeps me from ever speaking your name again?" Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I don't want you in jail, Seraphina. I really don't. But I have a son on the way. I have a legacy to protect. You've had 30 years of being the queen. It's over. Sign the papers. Take the Northside house. I'll even let you keep that. And disappear. Go to Charleston. Fade away." "And the new Mrs. Carter?" I asked. "Does she know she's marrying a man who stole her predecessor's father's life insurance?" Elias's face went white. The mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing the predator underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Evelyn has the book, Elias. The 1994 ledger. The one with your father-in-law's name next to the startup capital." He laughed, but the sound was brittle. "My mother is 82 and losing her mind. No court will take the word of a woman with early onset dementia and a ledger that's been sitting in a damp basement for 3 decades. The digital evidence is what matters, Sarah. And the digital evidence says you're a thief." "Then why are you here?" I asked. "If your case is so ironclad, why are you in an interrogation room at 2 a.m. begging me to sign a waiver? You're here because you know Julian Vane is already digging. You're here because you know that even if you send me to jail, I'll take the company down with me." Elias stood up, his chair screeching. "You always were too smart for your own good. But you're not smart enough to realize that in this city, I am the one people want to believe. You're the strong black woman, Seraphina. People respect you, but they don't like you. You're too cold, too perfect. They'll love watching you fall. They've been waiting for it." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "You have until 8 a.m. That's when the DA arrives. If the confession isn't signed by then, I stop trying to protect you. And Sarah?" "Yes, Elias?" "Jada wants the blue sapphire necklace, the one your father gave you for our 10th anniversary. She says it will look good with her eyes. I'll expect it back with the keys to the estate." The door slammed shut. I sat in the silence, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. They'll love watching you fall. He was right about one thing. Our community, our world, puts women like me on a pedestal specifically so they can see how far we'll drop. We aren't allowed to be human. We are only allowed to be symbols, and symbols don't get mercy. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, a small modification I'd asked the tailor to make months ago. My phone had been confiscated, yes, but they hadn't checked the lining of my Spanx. I pulled out a second, smaller device, a burner. I dialed Naomi. "Ma?" Her voice was frantic. "I'm outside the precinct. They won't let me in. Julian is here too. He's livid." "Listen to me, Naomi," I said, my voice low and sharp. "I need you to go to the North Side house. Do not go through the front door. Use the cellar key under the loose brick by the rose bushes. Evelyn is there, but she's scared." "Ma, what's happening?" "Elias is trying to trade my freedom for the company. He's framing me for the pension fund theft, but he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He told me the IT director is devastated. That means the IT director, Terrence, is still on his side. But Terrence has a weakness. Do you remember who paid for Terrence's mother's kidney transplant 3 years ago? Who made sure it was done at the private clinic and not the county hospital?" There was a silence on the other end. "You did, Ma, out of your private discretionary fund." "Elias doesn't know about that. He thinks I used company money. But I used the inheritance from my Aunt Bessie. I have the receipts in the safe in the North Side house." "Naomi, you find Terrence. You don't threaten him. You just remind him whose hands were holding his mother's when she woke up from surgery. And you tell him that the digital trail he's building has a very loud undo button." "I'm on it, Ma." "And Naomi?" "Yes?" "Don't worry about the sapphire necklace. Tell Jada she can have it. But tell her to look closely at the clasp. There's an inscription on the inside of the band." "What does it say?" I closed my eyes, picturing my father's face. "It says, 'Truth is a slow fire, but it burns everything eventually.'" I hung up and tucked the burner back into its hiding place. I leaned my head against the cold cinder block. I was tired. I was humiliated. I was a person of interest in a cell. But as the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. I felt light. Elias thought he was taking my life. He didn't realize he was just taking my chores. The morning light in a police precinct is a cruel thing. It doesn't wash over the room, it exposes it. It caught the dust motes dancing in the stale air and highlighted the coffee rings on the laminate table where Elias had sat just hours before, trying to trade my dignity for a signature. At 8 a.m., the door didn't open for the district attorney. It opened for Naomi. She didn't look like the girl who had been crying in the ballroom. She looked like the woman who had graduated top of her class at Howard Law and spent 5 years making senior partners at her firm tremble. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, uncompromising bun. She carried a leather briefcase like a shield. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice professional, her eyes screaming 1,000 other things. "Your counsel is here." Detective Holloway followed her in, looking like he hadn't slept either. He held a stack of folders. Behind him stood a man I recognized from the local news, District Attorney Arthur Sterling. Sterling was a man who lived for high-profile convictions. He saw the Carter embezzlement as his ticket to the governor's mansion. "Seraphina," Sterling said, pulling out a chair. "I'd say it's good to see you, but the circumstances are unfortunate." "Save the pleasantries, Arthur," I said. I was still in my midnight blue gown. The silk was wrinkled, and I was sure I smelled of the night's exhaustion, but I sat as if I were at the head of my own boardroom. "You have a deadline. It's 8:05. My husband told me I had until 8 to sign a confession. Since I haven't signed anything, I assume we're here to discuss the formal charges?" Sterling glanced at Naomi. "Your daughter has been very busy this morning, Seraphina. She's filed 3 emergency injunctions and a motion for a change of venue before I could even finish my first cup of coffee." "My daughter is efficient," I said. "It's a trait she inherited from me. Not the man currently occupying the Libby Hill estate." "Let's talk about that man," Naomi interrupted, sliding a tablet across the table. "While my father was busy grieving the loss of his marriage at the precinct, he failed to realize that his encrypted server isn't as closed as he thought. We've spent the last 4 hours with Terrence, the IT director." Sterling stiffened. "Terrence Miller? He's our star witness. He's the one who provided the logs showing Mrs. Carter's credentials being used to siphon the pension funds." "He did," Naomi said, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that meant she was about to go for the throat. "He provided them because my father threatened to terminate his mother's health insurance. Insurance my mother pays for out of a private trust, by the way, if he didn't comply. But Terrence is a man with a conscience. And once he realized that the strong black woman who saved his mother's life was being thrown to the wolves, his memory became much clearer." I watched Sterling's face. The confidence began to drain away, replaced by the wary look of a man who realized he'd been handed a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Terrence didn't just give us the logs," Naomi continued. "He gave us the metadata. You see, Detective Holloway, the digital trail shows my mother's credentials were used. But the IP address associated with those logins, they didn't come from my mother's laptop at the Northside house. They didn't even come from her office." "Where did they come from?" Holloway asked. "The guest house at the Libby Hill estate," Naomi said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Specifically, the router assigned to the suite where Jada, the new Mrs. Carter, has been staying for the last 3 months. It seems Jada is quite the hobbyist when it comes to keystroke logging." I felt a surge of something, not triumph, but a quiet, searing heat. Jada. Elias hadn't just found a younger woman. He had found a weapon. He had brought a viper into our home and taught her how to bite me. "That's circumstantial," Sterling argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone could have been in that guest house." "True," I said, speaking for the first time. "But only one person has a motive to erase 30 years of my history. Only one person needs that pension fund to be missing so the company looks insolvent when the divorce proceedings begin. Elias isn't framing me just to punish me, Arthur. He's framing me because he's already spent the money." The room went silent. "What are you talking about?" Sterling asked. The logistics contracts in Norfolk, I said. The ones Elias bragged about at the anniversary party? They don't exist. He's been running a shell game for 18 months. He's been using the pension fund to pay the interest on loans he took out to buy Jada that condo in Miami and the jewelry he's been flaunting. He needed a scapegoat. He needed the unbreakable Seraphina to be the one who broke the bank. I looked at Holloway. Check the Norfolk Port Authority records. You'll find that Carter Logistics hasn't had a valid permit there in over a year. He's been faking the invoices, and I have the real ones. Where? Holloway asked. In a leather-bound book, I said, under a radiator in a house my husband forgot I owned. But before we go get it, I want something. You're in no position to make demands, Seraphina, Sterling snapped. I think I am, I replied. Because if you walk out of this room and try to prosecute me based on Jada's amateur hacking, I will make sure every news outlet in this state knows that the district attorney's office was complicit in a domestic abuse case disguised as a financial crime. I want the new Mrs. Carter brought in for questioning. Now. And I want to be the one who tells her that the sapphire necklace she's wearing is currently being tracked as stolen property. Before we continue, let me know what you think of Jada's role in this. Did you expect the mistress to be part of the frame-up, or do you think she's just another pawn in Elias's game? Let me know in the comments. Sterling looked at Holloway. Holloway looked at the floor. Bring her in, Sterling muttered. 2 hours later, the precinct felt different. The strong black woman was no longer in a cell. I was in the observation room, watching through the one-way glass as Jada was led into interrogation room B. She wasn't wearing the champagne silk anymore. She was in a tracksuit, her hair messy, looking every bit the terrified girl she actually was. But around her neck, gleaming with a cold blue fire, was the sapphire necklace, my father's gift. Elias wasn't with her. He had been unavailable when the police arrived at the estate, likely meeting with his own lawyers, trying to figure out where the leak was. Naomi stood beside me, her arms crossed. She's shaking, Ma. Good, I said. Fear is a great purifier of lies. Detective Holloway entered the room with Jada. He didn't sit down. He simply stood over her. Ms. Jada, he began. We have some questions about your internet usage over the last few months. Jada looked up, her eyes wide and glassy. I don't know what you're talking about. Elias said everything was legal. He said it was just moving assets for the baby's future. The baby's future? I whispered to the glass. Elias told her the pension fund was his, Naomi said, reading the file in her hands. He told her you were trying to steal the inheritance from their unborn son, and that they had to protect it by moving it to an account in her name. In her name? I turned to Naomi. He put the stolen funds in her name? Every cent, Naomi said. He didn't just frame you, Ma. He set her up as the fall girl in case the frame-up didn't stick. If the police found the money, it would be in Jada's offshore account, not his. He'd claim she manipulated him, that she was a gold digger who tricked a grieving husband. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity for the girl on the other side of the glass. She was a villain, yes. She had insulted my life and stepped into my shoes while they were still warm. But she was also a girl who had believed a man like Elias Carter could love anyone more than he loved his own reflection. He's not coming for her, is he? I asked. His lawyers already filed a statement, Naomi said. They're claiming Elias had no knowledge of Jada's digital activities and that he is shocked and saddened by the allegations. I watched Jada. She was touching the sapphire necklace, her fingers trembling against the stones. "Detective," I said into the intercom, my voice startling Holloway. "Ask her about the necklace. Ask her to read the inscription on the clasp." In the room, Holloway paused. He leaned down. "That's a beautiful piece of jewelry, Jada. May I see the clasp?" Jada flinched, but she reached back and unhooked it, handing it to him. Holloway took a small magnifying glass from his pocket. "There's an inscription here," he said. "Truth is a slow fire, but it burns everything eventually." "Do you know what that means, Jada?" "No," she whispered. "Elias said it was just an old family motto." "It's not a motto," Holloway said, his voice hardening. "It's a warning. And right now, the fire is at your feet. Your husband just told the DA that he thinks you've been stealing from his company. He's claiming you're the one who forged the documents." Jada's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. "What? No, he said we were a team. He said Seraphina was the one who was evil. He said she was the one who stole from the workers." "He's using you, Jada," Holloway said. "Just like he used her for 30 years. But there's a difference. Seraphina Carter has an empire. You just have a son who's going to be born while his mother is in a federal penitentiary." Jada broke. It wasn't a quiet break. It was a howl of realization. She began to sob, the kind of deep, guttural sounds that fill a room with the scent of tragedy. "He made me do it!" she screamed. "He gave me the passwords. He told me which buttons to click. He has a second phone, a black one, where he keeps the account numbers. It's in the safe behind the portrait in the library. Please, don't let him do this to me." I turned away from the glass. I couldn't watch it anymore. "Naomi," I said, my voice cold and clear. "Call Julian. Tell him to meet the police at the Libby Hill estate. And tell him I want the library sealed. I'm going home." "Ma, the police still have the North Side house taped off," Naomi said. "I'm not going to the North Side house," I said. "I'm going to Libby Hill. Elias thinks he's evicted me, but he forgot that the deed to that land is in my father's name, and my father left it to me, not the Carter estate." I walked out of the observation room. I passed Sterling, who was standing in the hallway looking like a man whose career was crumbling. "Arthur," I said, stopping in front of him. "Seraphina," he said, his voice cautious. "You have 1 hour to drop the charges against me and issue a public statement clearing my name. If you don't, I'm going to walk across the street to the Richmond Times-Dispatch and give them a copy of the 1994 ledger. I'll make sure they know that you were so eager to convict a black woman that you ignored 30 years of evidence against a white-collar thief." "I was just following the evidence, Seraphina." "Follow the evidence to the library, Arthur," I said, stepping closer. "And if you ever look at my daughter with that patronizing smirk again, I'll buy the building your office is in and turn it into a shelter for the women your policies have failed." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the precinct, the morning sun finally hitting my face. The valet from the Fairmont was there. He wasn't working. He was just standing by my Mercedes, which had been towed to the precinct. He held the keys out to me. "Mrs. Carter?" he said, a small, knowing smile on his face. "I figured you'd be needing these." "Thank you, Henry," I said. I got into the car. I didn't drive to Libby Hill yet. I drove to a small park overlooking the James River. I sat on a bench, still in my midnight blue gown, watching the water rush over the rocks. I thought about the ballroom. I thought about the silence after the toast. I thought about the way the new Mrs. Carter had looked in the champagne silk. And then I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated freedom. Elias had tried to destroy me, and in doing so, he had accidentally handed me the one thing I never would have taken for myself: an exit. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'm at the house, Sarah. He's packing a bag. He's trying to leave before the police arrive. He has the ledger from the safe. What do you want me to do?" It was Marcus, my son, the one who had stayed at the party. I typed back one word: wait. I got back into the car. The strong black woman was finished. The matriarch was just getting started. The wrought iron gates of the Libby Hill estate were standing wide open when I arrived. It was a breach of protocol that would have normally set my teeth on edge. 30 years of maintaining the Carter image meant the gates were always closed, the lawn was always manicured, and the facade was always impenetrable. But as I pulled my Mercedes into the circular driveway, the house looked like a beautiful body that had finally surrendered to a long illness. Lights were blazing in every window, a frantic, wasteful glow against the midday sun. 2 cars I didn't recognize, likely hired security or Elias's fixers, were parked haphazardly on the grass. The front door, a $10,000 slab of solid mahogany I'd picked out myself in Florence, was propped open with a designer suitcase. I sat in the car for a moment, the engine idling. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. I looked at the house. I had decorated every room. I had chosen the silk wallpaper in the dining room where we'd hosted governors and CEOs. I had overseen the restoration of the crown molding. I had filled these rooms with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of children's laughter, and later, the heavy, suffocating silence of a marriage that had become a museum. I stepped out of the car. I was still wearing the midnight blue gown. It was a ruin of silk and memories. But as I walked up the stone steps, I felt more like a queen than I ever had during the galas. The foyer was a graveyard of stuff. Elias's golf clubs were leaned against a George III sideboard. A stack of expensive watches sat on the marble floor next to a pile of folded cashmere sweaters. It was the frantic, undignified packing of a man who realized the ground was no longer solid beneath his feet. I heard shouting from the library. "I don't care what the board says. I am the chairman. I built this." That was Elias. His voice was shrill, lacking the resonant authority that usually commanded the room. It was the sound of a man trying to talk a hurricane into stopping. "You're not the chairman anymore, Dad. You were removed by emergency vote 40 minutes ago." That was Marcus. His voice was low, centered, and terrifyingly like mine. I walked toward the library. I didn't hurry. I didn't sneak. My heels clicked on the marble, a rhythmic announcement of my arrival. I stopped in the doorway. The library was a mess. Books had been pulled from the shelves, the leather-bound classics I'd curated to give Elias the appearance of a man who read. The portrait of Elias that hung over the fireplace, the one where he looked like a statesman, had been tilted to the side, revealing the wall safe behind it. Elias was standing by the safe, his tuxedo shirt unbuttoned at the neck, His face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. He was holding a small black leather bag and a thick sheaf of papers. Marcus was standing by the desk, his arms crossed, watching his father with a look of profound, quiet disappointment. "Seraphina," Elias gasped when he saw me. He didn't call me Sarah. He used my full name, the way he did when he was trying to remind himself that he was supposed to be in charge of me. "You should be in a cell," he spat, his eyes darting toward the door. "Sterling promised me they'd hold you until the arraignment." Sterling is currently busy trying to figure out how to explain why his office was used as a tool for domestic retaliation, I said, stepping into the room. I looked at the bag in his hand. And Jada is currently explaining the metadata to Detective Holloway. It seems she's decided that a plea deal is more attractive than a life of loyalty to a man who's already packing a suitcase for one. Elias's hand tightened on the bag. "Jada is a child. She doesn't know anything. She's confused." "She's pregnant, Elias," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "And she's realized that you were planning to let her give birth in a federal prison while you disappeared to that offshore account in the Caymans, the one you thought I didn't know about." I turned to Marcus. "Are you all right, son?" Marcus nodded. "I'm fine, Ma. I told him he wasn't taking the black phone. He tried to tell me it was corporate property. I reminded him that I'm the acting vice president of operations, and technically, his security clearance was revoked an hour ago." Elias let out a bark of a laugh, a sound that was pure desperation. "Acting vice president? You're a boy playing in a man's suit. I made you. I gave you that title." "And I'm the one who's been actually running the logistics for 3 years while you were scouting new talent in Miami," Marcus said. "I know about the Norfolk shortfall, Dad. I've been covering the discrepancies from my own dividends because I didn't want the family name to be dragged through the mud. I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Elias stepped toward Marcus, the black bag swinging. "I don't need protection from my own son." "No," I said, stepping between them. "You need protection from yourself, Elias. But you've run out of people willing to provide it." I looked at the tilted portrait. The man in the painting looked so confident, so unbreakable. "Leave the bag, Elias," I said. "This is mine," he hissed. "The ledger, the accounts. I built this empire." "You built it on a theft from a dying man," I said. "Evelyn told me. She gave me the 1994 book. The fleet you bought with my father's life insurance? That makes the foundation of this company a fruit of the poisonous tree. Technically, I don't even need a divorce settlement. I can simply move for a full rescission of the corporate charter based on fraud." Elias froze. The red drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and old. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She gave you the book?" he whispered. "She's at my house," I said. "She's finally choosing the daughter she loves over the son she's ashamed of." Elias slumped back against the desk. The bag slipped from his fingers and hit the Persian rug with a dull thud. He looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see the lion. I saw the scavenger. I saw the man who had been terrified since 1994 that someone would eventually look at the books. "What do you want, Seraphina?" he asked, his voice broken. "You've won. You've taken the company. You've turned my children against me. You've turned my mother against me. What's left?" I want you to walk out of this house, I said. Not with a suitcase, not with a watch collection, not with the keys to the Mercedes. You can't do that, he said, a spark of his old arrogance returning. This house is mine. It's the Carter estate. That's where you're wrong, I said. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single, yellowed document. It wasn't a corporate filing. It was a deed. When we bought this land in 1998, you were so busy trying to hide the startup capital from the IRS that you had me sign the purchase agreement. You thought it was a formality. You thought, Sarah is an extension of me. What's hers is mine. But you didn't read the rider my father's lawyer drafted. This land was purchased in my name, with a life estate granted to my father. When he died, the title didn't pass to the Carter estate. It passed to me, personally. This house isn't marital property, Elias. It's an inheritance. I stepped closer to him, my voice a whisper. You've been living in my house for 25 years, Elias. You've been sleeping in my bed, eating my food, and using my air. And as of 10 a.m. this morning, I've filed an emergency eviction. You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry in your pockets and leave. 10 minutes? Elias looked at the piles of clothes, the watches, the life he had tried to pack. Seraphina, be reasonable. I have nowhere to go. The police, the press will be at the gate in an hour. Then I suggest you start walking, I said. Maybe Jada will let you sleep on the floor of her cell. I turned to Marcus. Call the gate. Tell them to allow the Richmond Times-Dispatch through in exactly 15 minutes. I want them to get a photo of the king leaving his castle. No! Elias shouted. You can't do that! My reputation! Your reputation died in the ballroom, Elias, I said. I'm just here to bury the body. Elias looked at me, then at Marcus. He looked for a moment like he might strike me, but Marcus stepped forward, his presence a silent wall of steel. Elias let out a choked, sobbing sound. He reached down and grabbed his tuxedo jacket from the chair. He didn't look at the black bag. He didn't look at the jewelry. He walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the library, the room that had been his throne room. I loved you, Sarah, he said, in my own way. That was the problem, Elias, I said, my back to him as I looked at the tilted portrait. Your way was a hunger that never stopped eating. I was just the only thing you couldn't finish. He walked out. A moment later, I heard the heavy thud of the mahogany front door closing. Marcus let out a long, shaky breath. He's gone, Ma. He's gone, I repeated. I walked over to the portrait. I reached up and straightened it. Elias's painted eyes looked back at me, arrogant and still. I took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and old paper filling my lungs. Marcus, I said, call your sister. Tell her to bring Julian and the forensic team. We have a lot of work to do. And call the catering company. I want this house scrubbed from top to bottom. I want the smell of him out of here by tonight. What about the mistress, Ma? Marcus asked. And the baby? I looked down at the black bag on the floor. The baby is a Robinson Carter, whether Elias likes it or not. We'll take care of the child. As for Jada, she'll serve her time, and then we'll see if she's learned the difference between a crown and a cage. I walked over to the window. In the distance, I could see the flash of a news camera at the gate. I saw Elias's slumped figure walking down the long, paved driveway, his tuxedo jacket over his arm, looking like a man who had finally realized the world didn't owe him a throne. I stood there for a long time, watching the strong black woman fade away, and the woman I was meant to be take her place. The phone on the desk rang. I didn't answer it. I walked to the sideboard, picked up a small, silver-framed photo of my father, and pressed it to my chest. "We're okay, Daddy," I whispered. "The foundation is back." But then I noticed something. On the desk, where the black bag had been, was a small white envelope I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't addressed to Elias. It was addressed to me, in Jada's handwriting. I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sonogram photo and a note. "He's not the only one who was lying, Seraphina. Ask him about the other Mrs. Carter, the one from 1992, the one he never divorced." I felt the room go cold. If Elias had never divorced his first wife, then our marriage of 30 years was a lie. Our children were illegitimate in the eyes of the law, and every document I had signed as his wife, the deeds, the trusts, the corporate restructuring, was a legal minefield. I looked out the window. Elias was almost at the gate. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "get your father back here. Now." "Ma, what is it?" "He didn't just steal my father's money," I said, the paper trembling in my hand. "He stole my entire identity." Marcus didn't ask questions. He ran. He didn't wait for the elevator, his shoes thundering down the grand staircase of the foyer. I stood at the library window, the sonogram and the crumpled note from Jada still clutched in my hand. Through the glass, I watched the scene unfold at the end of the long, pebble-paved driveway. Elias was nearly at the gate, his tuxedo jacket slung over one shoulder like a traveler who had simply run out of road. Marcus reached him just as the heavy iron bars began to groan shut. There was a struggle, not a physical one, but a clash of wills. I saw Marcus grab his father's arm, gesturing wildly back toward the house. Elias pulled away, his posture stiff with a sudden, defensive panic. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I walked out of the library, through the foyer, and onto the wide stone portico. The humidity of the Virginia afternoon was beginning to rise, thick and suffocating. The news cameras at the gate were buzzing like flies. I could see the reporters straining against the bars, their long lens cameras clicking rhythmically, capturing the matriarch standing on her porch while her king was dragged back to the throne he'd been evicted from. Marcus was leading Elias back up the drive. Elias wasn't fighting anymore. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his face a mask of gray, ashen exhaustion. When they reached the foot of the steps, Marcus let go of his father's sleeve. He looked up at me, his chest heaving. "He tried to say it was a joke, Ma. He tried to say Jada was just hormonal and making up stories." I looked down at Elias. I didn't say a word. I simply held out the note. The wind caught the corner of the paper, fluttering it like a white flag. Elias looked at it, then slowly raised his eyes to mine. The arrogance was gone. The predator was gone. What was left was the small-town boy from a Maryland courthouse who had tried to outrun his own history. "Inside," I said. It wasn't a request. We walked back into the foyer. I signaled to the 2 security guards to close the mahogany doors and stand outside. I wanted no witnesses but my son and the ghosts of the life I'd spent 30 years building. We returned to the library. The room felt smaller now, crowded with the weight of a new, darker truth. Beverly Ann Vance, I said, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Jada's note says you married her in 1992, in Hagerstown, 2 years before you and I stood in front of Reverend Hightower and 500 guests. Elias sank into the leather chair behind the desk, my desk now. He put his head in his hands. The silence stretched, heavy and jagged. It was a mistake, he whispered into his palms. I was 21. She was 20. We were kids, Sarah. It lasted 3 months. She went back to her mama in Delaware and I never saw her again. I thought she'd filed the papers. She said she would. You thought? Marcus's voice cracked with a fury that made the crystal decanters on the sideboard rattle. You built a 30-year life on a thought, Dad? You had 3 children. You built a multi-million-dollar corporation. You sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday for 3 decades, knowing that every time you called Mom your wife, you were committing a crime. I forgot about her, Elias shouted, looking up, his eyes bloodshot. She didn't matter. I met Seraphina and she was everything. She was the grace I needed. She was the future. If I'd told her then, she never would have married a boy with a messy divorce pending. I was protecting us. You weren't protecting us, I said, my voice terrifyingly soft. You were protecting your access to me. You knew that Seraphina Robinson didn't marry messy men. You knew my father would never have let me near you if he knew you were a man who abandoned a wife in Delaware without a second thought. I walked around the desk and leaned over him. I could smell the expensive scotch he'd been drinking earlier and the sour scent of cold sweat. If that marriage was never dissolved, Elias, then our marriage is bigamous. It's void. Do you understand what that means? Elias didn't answer. He knew. It means, I continued, that for 30 years I have been a legal stranger to you. It means every joint tax return we filed was fraudulent. It means every property we purchased as husband and wife has a clouded title. It means that if you go down for embezzlement, I have no marital privilege. I can be forced to testify against you. And more importantly, it means that the Carter estate, the company, the trusts, the legacy, is a legal house of cards. The children, Marcus whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Ma, does this mean we're... It means you're the children of a woman who was deceived and a man who was a ghost, I said, turning to my son. I reached out and touched his cheek. But you're still my children, and I am still a Robinson. My father's blood is in your veins, and that blood doesn't need a marriage license to be legitimate. I turned back to Elias. Where is she? Beverly. I don't know, Elias moaned. I haven't heard from her in 30 years. I swear. Jada found her, I said, tapping the note. Jada found her because Jada is young, and she knows how to use the internet better than you do. She found a Beverly Ann Vance in Wilmington. She's a nurse. She has 2 grown children, and according to Jada, she still uses the last name Vance because she never received a final decree of divorce. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For years, I had wondered why Elias was always so insistent on me staying out of the legalities of our early years. Why he always had his lawyer handle the personal filings while I handled the corporate ones. He wasn't just being a traditional chauvinistic man. He was a man building a wall around a secret that could turn his entire world into a crime scene. "You're going to call her," I said. "Sarah, no. You're going to call her right now," I repeated. "And you're going to find out if you are a husband or a felon. Because if that woman hasn't signed a paper in 30 years, then I am going to the district attorney myself. I will not be your accomplice in a 30-year fraud." "If you do that," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, desperate hiss, "you lose everything too. The house, the company, it all goes into probate. The state will freeze everything while they sort out the rightful heirs. You'll be penniless, Seraphina. Is your grace worth living in a shelter?" I looked around the library. I looked at the first edition books, the Persian rugs, the gold leaf frames. I thought about the 30 years of strong Black woman labor I had poured into these walls. I thought about the thousands of meals I'd cooked, the hundreds of galas I'd chaired, the decades of holding my tongue so he could feel powerful. And I realized that I had already been living in a shelter. A beautiful, expensive, gilded shelter where I was the only one doing the maintenance. "Elias," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. "I spent the last 6 months moving my father's money and my own inheritance into trusts that you can't touch. I have the North Side house. I have my own name. I am not afraid of being penniless. I am only afraid of being you." I picked up the desk phone and pushed it toward him. "Call her." Elias stared at the phone. He looked at Marcus, who was standing by the door like a sentry. He looked at me. Then, with trembling fingers, he began to dial the number Jada had scrawled on the back of the sonogram. He put it on speaker. The ringing tone was loud in the quiet room. 1 ring, 2, 3. "Hello?" a woman's voice answered. It was a tired voice, but steady, professional. The voice of a woman who had seen a lot of long shifts. Elias's throat clicked as he swallowed. "Beverly? Is this Beverly Ann?" There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the sound of a television in the background, a game show, the theme music bright and mocking. "Who is this?" the woman asked, her tone sharpening. "It's Elias," he whispered. "Elias Vance, from Hagerstown." Another silence. This one felt like it lasted a century. "Elias," Beverly said. There was no joy in her voice, no shock, only a flat, weary recognition. "I wondered when you'd finally get around to calling. I saw your face in the news last night. The logistics titan of Richmond. You've done well for a man who left for a pack of cigarettes in 1992 and never came back." "Beverly, I need to know about the papers, the divorce. You said you'd file them." A dry, bitter laugh came through the speaker. "I said I'd file them if you sent the money for the lawyer, Elias. You never sent the money. You never answered my letters. You never even came back to see if I was okay." "But did you ever file? On your own?" "With what money?" Beverly asked. "I was 20 years old with a baby on the way. Your baby, Elias. I had to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. I didn't have $500 for a lawyer to divorce a ghost. I eventually moved on. I met a good man. We've been together 25 years. We never married legally because I didn't want to explain to him that I was still tied to a coward in Virginia. I felt the air leave the room. My son, Marcus, closed his eyes and leaned his head against the doorframe. Elias looked like he was about to faint. So, we're still... legally? Yes, Elias, Beverly said. According to the state of Maryland, I am still Beverly Ann Vance. And I expect you're calling me now because you're in trouble, and you need me to sign something to save your skin. Isn't that right? Elias couldn't speak. I reached out and pressed the button on the phone. Beverly? My name is Seraphina. I've been living as Elias's wife for 30 years. The silence on the other end was different this time. It was soft, empathetic. Oh, honey, Beverly whispered. I am so sorry. I truly am. I saw the pictures of you. You looked so proud. I always wanted to reach out, to warn you, but I thought maybe he'd changed. I thought maybe he'd finally done right by someone. He hasn't, I said, my voice steady. But I'm going to do right by both of us now. Beverly, I'm going to send a car for you, and a lawyer. I want you to come to Richmond, not for him, for us. What are you going to do, Seraphina? I looked at Elias. He was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He knew that the 2 women he had used and discarded were finally in the same room. I'm going to dissolve the Carter name, I said, and then I'm going to help you get 30 years of back child support. I hung up the phone. I turned to Marcus. Call your sister. Tell her we don't need a divorce lawyer anymore. We need a criminal defense attorney for a bigamy charge. And tell her to call the bank. I want every account associated with Elias Vance Carter frozen for identity verification immediately. Seraphina, please, Elias begged, sliding out of the chair and onto his knees. Don't do this. Think of the children. Think of the scandal. The scandal is yours, Elias, I said, walking toward the door. I'm just the woman who's finally stopping the bill from being sent to my father's house. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at him. Oh, and Elias? Jada was right about one thing. The sapphire necklace looks much better on a woman who actually owns her own name. I walked out of the library, the click of my heels echoing through the house like a gavel. I didn't go to my room to pack. I went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, with a hint of honey. I sat at the small breakfast nook and watched the sun begin to set over the James River. The strong black woman was gone. The backbone had snapped. And for the first time in my life, I felt perfectly, beautifully whole. But as I sipped my tea, the front doorbell rang. Not the frantic ringing of the press, but a steady, calm chime. I walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was a woman I hadn't seen in decades. She was tall, elegant, and holding a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Elias's car. Seraphina? She asked. Yes. My name is Diane Sterling, she said. I'm Arthur Sterling's wife, but more importantly, I'm the chief legal counsel for the state tax board. And I think it's time we talked about where Elias has really been hiding the money for the last 30 years. I stepped back to let her in. The fire was growing, and this time, I wasn't the one trying to put it out. Diane Sterling did not wait to be asked. She stepped into the foyer with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 30 years navigating rooms where her presence was both required and resented. She set her briefcase on the mahogany sideboard, the same one Elias had leaned his golf clubs against only an hour before, and looked around the high-ceilinged hall. "It's a beautiful house, Seraphina," Diane said, her voice like velvet stretched over stone. "I remember when you bought it. Arthur told me it was a bold move for a family like yours in this neighborhood. I told him it wasn't a move. It was a conquest." I led her into the drawing room, away from the library where Elias was still presumably kneeling on the floor, contemplating the ruins of his 30-year charade. I hadn't yet told her about the bigamy. I hadn't told her that the conquest was built on a legal void. "Diane," I said, motioning for her to sit, "I appreciate you coming, but why now? Your husband was ready to put me in a jumpsuit this morning." "Arthur is a politician, Seraphina. He follows the scent of the winner. This morning, Elias looked like the winner. By noon, the wind shifted." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "But I'm not here because of Arthur. I'm here because for 15 years, I've been watching Elias Carter funnel millions of dollars through the city's redevelopment fund, money that was supposed to go to low-income housing in the North Side and the East End." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. "Logistics contracts. He said he was managing the supply chain for the construction materials." "He was," Diane said, sliding a spreadsheet across the coffee table. "But look at the line items. He was billing the city for premium grade A lumber and steel while sourcing condemned materials from a warehouse in Hopewell. He pocketed the difference, roughly $4 million over 5 years. And he didn't do it alone." I looked at the names on the spreadsheet. My breath hitched. "The church board," I whispered. "And 3 members of the city council," Diane added. "Elias didn't just build a company, Seraphina. He built a system of mutual compromise. He made sure everyone had a little bit of blood on their hands so no one would ever point a finger. He thought he was untouchable because if he went down, the whole city's leadership went with him." I leaned back, the silk of the sofa cool against my skin. I thought about the Sunday mornings. I thought about the way Deacon Miller would clasp Elias's hand and thank him for his vision. I thought about the charity auctions where we'd raise money for community growth, while my husband was quietly harvesting the very community we were pretending to save. "He used me as the face of it," I said. My voice was a hollow thing. "The matriarch. The woman people trusted. They signed those contracts because I was the one who handed them the pen. They thought if Seraphina Carter was involved, it was holy work." "You were his shield," Diane said. "But he's about to lose that shield. And when he does, these men, the councilmen, the deacons, they aren't going to stand by him. They're going to find a way to make it look like it was all his idea. Or better yet, yours." I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. "There's more, Diane," I said, turning back to her. "Elias never divorced his first wife." The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the central air conditioning. Diane Sterling, a woman who had likely seen every level of corruption the state of Virginia had to offer, blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Beverly Ann Vance, 1992, Hagerstown, Maryland. I spoke to her on the phone 20 minutes ago. The marriage was never dissolved." Diane's professional mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. She stood up, her eyes wide. "Then your marriage, the corporate restructuring of 2012, the property transfers—" "All voidable," I said. "Every document I signed as Mrs. Elias Carter is a legal hallucination, which means the city contracts he signed using our joint assets as collateral are also fraudulent. Diane began to pace, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood. Seraphina, do you realize what this means? If the marriage is void, you aren't his spouse. You're a co-conspirator who has been illegally misrepresenting her status for 30 years. Arthur won't be able to protect you from that, even if he wanted to. The feds will move in by morning. I know, I said. That's why I called Beverly. And that's why I'm glad you're here. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that a man who commits bigamy and fraud on this scale is a man who doesn't have friends. He has hostages. And hostages are very eager to negotiate once the doors are kicked in. I looked toward the hallway. Marcus was standing there. He had changed out of his suit into a simple black t-shirt and jeans. He looked younger and older, all at once. Behind him, Naomi had arrived. She was still in her court attire, her face a mask of cold, legal fury. "Ma," Naomi said, stepping into the room. "I've seen the Maryland records. It's true. The clerk in Hagerstown confirmed it. There is no final decree." "And the children?" Diane asked, looking at my daughter. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Legally, we are the issue of a putative marriage. We have rights to the estate, but it's going to be a nightmare to prove in probate if the company is liquidated by the state." "We aren't liquidating," I said. I looked at my children, the two people I had spent my entire life trying to protect from the harshness of the world, only to realize I had been the one raising them in a house made of lies. "Naomi, you're going to work with Diane. I want a full audit of every city contract signed since 2010. We're going to find every cent Elias diverted, and we're going to give it back." "Ma, that's millions," Marcus said. "We'll be left with nothing." "We'll be left with our names," I said. "A name is a foundation. A lie is just a hole in the ground." I turned back to Diane. "If we self-report, if we provide the evidence before the feds knock, can we save the company for the children?" Diane looked at the spreadsheet, then at me. "If you hand them Elias on a silver platter, along with the councilmen and the deacons? Possibly. But you'll be making enemies of the most powerful men in Richmond. You won't be able to walk into a grocery store without someone looking at you like you're a traitor." "I've spent 30 years being looked at as a strong black woman," I said. "I've been a symbol for so long, I forgot how to be a person. I don't care if they hate me. I only care that they can't say I lied to them." Suddenly, a loud crash came from the library. It was followed by a roar, a primal, animalistic sound that didn't sound like Elias Vance Carter. It sounded like something breaking that could never be mended. We all ran toward the library. Elias was standing in the center of the room. He had overturned the heavy oak desk. The lamp was shattered on the floor, the glass glinting like diamonds in the dim light. He was holding a heavy bronze statuette, an award he'd won for community leadership, and he was staring at the wall where my father's portrait should have been. "I gave you everything!" he screamed, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the air. "I built this. I made them respect us. You think they would have let a Robinson into the club? You think they would have listened to your father? He was a shipyard worker. I made us royalty." "You made us a target, Elias," I said, my voice steady. He turned to me, and for a moment, I saw the madness in his eyes. It was the madness of a man who had lived his own lie for so long, he had finally started to believe it. "You're nothing without me," he hissed, pointing the bronze statue at me. "You're just a nurse with a fancy dress. You think these people love you? They love the Mrs. Carter I created. They love the money I stole for you. You enjoyed every bit of it. The trips to Paris, the silk sheets, the jewelry. You didn't ask questions then, did you, Seraphina? You just smiled and took the checks." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, because there was a sliver of truth in them. I hadn't asked. I had known Elias was ambitious. I had known he was ruthless. But I had chosen to look at the grace I was building rather than the grit it took to fund it. I had been his silent partner in more ways than one. I had been the one who made the theft look like a blessing. "You're right, Elias," I said. My voice didn't waver, but I felt the weight of the confession in my chest. I didn't ask. I let my pride blind me to your pathology. I wanted the dream as much as you did, but the difference between us is that I'm willing to wake up." "You won't wake up," he laughed, a jagged, terrifying sound, "because I'm not the only one going to jail. If I'm a bigamist, you're a fraud. If I'm a thief, you're the fence. We go down together, Sarah. That's the deal we made 30 years ago." He lunged toward the desk, reaching for the black bag he'd dropped earlier. "Get back!" Marcus shouted, stepping in front of me. But Elias wasn't reaching for a weapon. He grabbed a small silver lighter from the floor. "If I can't have it," he whispered, "no one can." He flicked the lighter. The flame was small, a tiny orange flicker in the shadows of the library. He moved toward the curtains, the heavy velvet drapes I had ordered from Italy. "Elias, don't!" I said. "It's all paper, Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "The contracts, the deeds, the marriage license, it all burns the same." He touched the flame to the velvet. For a second, nothing happened. Then a thin line of smoke curled upward. A tiny orange glow began to eat at the fabric. "Dad, stop!" Naomi cried, reaching for her phone to call the fire department. But I didn't move. I watched the fire. It was a slow fire, just like the inscription on the necklace. "Let it burn," I said. "Ma?" Marcus turned to me, horror in his eyes. "The house, the history." "The history is a lie, Marcus," I said. "The house is a monument to a theft. Let it burn." Elias looked at me, the lighter still in his hand. He looked confused. He had expected me to scream. He had expected me to beg him to save the Carter estate. He didn't realize that I had already moved everything that mattered: the 1994 ledger, the deeds to the North Side house, the trusts for the children, out of this building months ago. The fire began to climb. The velvet hissed as the flames grew, licking at the crown molding. The room began to fill with the sweet, acrid scent of burning silk. "You're crazy," Elias whispered, dropping the lighter. He backed away from the heat. "You're just going to stand there?" "I've been standing here for 30 years, Elias," I said. "I'm used to the heat." Diane Sterling grabbed my arm. "Seraphina, we have to get out of here. The smoke!" "Go," I said to my children and Diane. "Take the briefcase, get to the cars." "Ma, come with us!" Marcus grabbed my hand. "I'll be right behind you," I said. "I just need to say goodbye." I waited until they were in the hallway. The library was becoming an oven. The portrait of Elias was already being consumed, the paint bubbling and blackening, his arrogant smile melting into a grotesque smear of soot. I looked at Elias. He was standing by the door, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp realization of what he'd done. He looked at the fire, then at me. "Sarah." "The new Mrs. Carter is waiting for you at the gate, Elias," I said. "I suggest you go find her. She's the only one left who doesn't know who you really are." I walked past him. I didn't look back. I walked through the foyer. The smoke was beginning to roll across the ceiling in thick gray waves. I stepped out onto the portico. The air outside was cool and sweet. I walked down the stone steps. Naomi, Marcus, and Diane were standing by the cars. At the end of the driveway, the press was in a frenzy. They could see the smoke pouring from the second-story windows. They could see the matriarch walking away from her burning palace. I reached the cars. I didn't get in. I turned and watched. The Libby Hill estate was an inferno within minutes. The old wood, the expensive fabrics, the 30 years of secrets, they all provided excellent fuel. The orange glow reflected in the windows, making the house look like it was filled with gold. A few minutes later, Elias stumbled out of the front door. He was coughing, his tuxedo ruined, his face blackened with soot. He fell to his knees on the lawn, watching as the roof of the library collapsed with a thunderous roar. He had tried to burn the evidence. He had tried to burn the memory. But he had forgotten that you can't burn the truth once it's already been told. I looked at Diane. "Is the file in the car?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Good. Call the FBI. Tell them Seraphina Robinson is ready to give her statement." Before we continue, let me know, would you have let the house burn? Or would you have tried to save the monument to your life? Let me know in the comments. I got into the back seat of my Mercedes. Marcus was in the driver's seat. Naomi was beside him. "Where to, Ma?" Marcus asked. I looked at the burning house in the rearview mirror. I saw the fire trucks arriving, their sirens a mournful wail in the twilight. I saw the king sitting on his grass, alone, while his kingdom turned to ash. "The north side," I said. "I want to see my mother-in-law. And then I want to go to sleep in a house that actually belongs to me." As we pulled away, the sapphire necklace, which I had taken from the precinct, sat in my lap. I picked it up and looked at the inscription one last time. "Truth is a slow fire, but it burns everything eventually." The fire was no longer slow. It was a roar. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't afraid of the heat. The North Side house didn't smell like Italian velvet or expensive cedar. It smelled of floor wax, dried lavender, and the faint, lingering ghost of my grandmother's Sunday pot roast. It was a small brick sanctuary that had stood for 80 years while empires rose and fell in the hills above the river. As Marcus pulled the Mercedes into the narrow driveway, the rain began to fall again. Not the dramatic thunderstorm of earlier, but a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to be trying to wash the scent of the fire off my skin. I stepped out of the car. My midnight blue gown was stained with soot at the hem. My hair smelled like a house fire. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. It was the vibration of a sudden, total lack of weight. The strong black woman armor hadn't just been removed. It had been melted down. "Ma," Marcus said, coming around to the side of the car. He reached out to steady me, his eyes searching mine. "You're okay. We're okay." "I am more than okay, Marcus," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. I am finally standing on my own ground. We walked up the porch steps. Before we could reach the door, it swung open. Evelyn was there. She looked older than she had this morning, her shoulders hunched under a thick wool shawl. Behind her, the house was warm and dimly lit. She looked past me at the glow on the horizon, the faint orange smudge in the sky where the Libby Hill estate was still smoldering. "He did it, didn't he?" she whispered. "He tried to burn the world down because he couldn't own it." "He burned the house, Evelyn," I said, stepping into the hallway. "But the world is still here, and so are we." Evelyn didn't cry. She just took my hand, her grip like dry parchment. "I heard about the woman, Beverly. My sister-in-law called me from Maryland. The word is out, Seraphina. The family knows. The church knows." "Let them know," I said. I led everyone into the kitchen. Naomi, Marcus, and Diane Sterling followed, looking like a group of survivors from a shipwreck. We sat at the small oak table. It was crowded. This table was meant for 3, not 5, but the proximity felt right. It felt like a bunker. Diane set her briefcase on the counter. "The FBI has been notified. I spoke to the field office. They're giving you until 8 a.m. tomorrow to come in for a voluntary statement before they issue the warrants for Elias and the council members. Arthur is currently trying to distance himself from the redevelopment fund, but he knows I have the records." "And Beverly?" I asked. "She's in a car," Naomi said, checking her phone. "A private transport I arranged. She should be here within the hour. She's bringing her son, Elias Jr." The room went silent. Elias Jr. The name felt like a physical blow. I had 2 children with this man. I had spent 30 years believing they were his only legacy. To hear that there was a junior out there, a man who was likely 31 or 32 years old, was to realize that my children were the second draft of a life Elias had already failed at. "He never mentioned him," Evelyn whispered, her eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. "I knew Beverly was pregnant when he left. I asked him for years. He told me the baby didn't make it. He told me he'd handled it." "He handled it by deleting them," I said. I stood up and went to the sink. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to scrub away the soot and the shame. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror over the sink. I looked like a woman who had been to war. "Naomi," I said without turning around, "the bigamy charge. How does it affect the corporate assets?" Naomi sighed, the sound of a lawyer who had already spent the last 2 hours running every scenario. "If the marriage is void ab initio, meaning it never existed in the eyes of the law, then there is no marital property. However, since you were a putative spouse, meaning you believed in good faith that you were married, the court can still grant you a division of assets. But it's messy, Ma. The creditors are going to come for everything once the fraud is exposed. The only things that are safe are the assets we moved into the Robinson trusts months ago." "Which is why we're self-reporting the city contracts," I said. "We're going to be the ones who find the money he stole. We're going to be the ones who offer the restitution. We're not going to wait for a jury to tell us what's right." "It could still mean prison, Seraphina," Diane warned. "Even with cooperation. You signed those contracts. Your name is on the audits." "I'll take whatever comes," I said, "as long as my children are clear." "Ma, no," Marcus started, but I held up a hand. "I spent 30 years being his silent partner, Marcus. Whether I knew the extent of the theft or not, I enjoyed the life it bought. I sat in that house while the North Side struggled. I wore that jewelry while the East End went without housing. I was his grace, yes, but I was also his camouflage. I owe the city a debt, and I intend to pay it. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a man fleeing a fire. It was a heavy, hesitant knock. I walked to the door. I took a deep breath and opened it. Standing on the porch was a woman who looked like a mirror image of the life I might have had if I'd stayed in a small town. She was dressed in a simple navy nurse's scrub top and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked tired, her face etched with the lines of a woman who had worked for every penny she ever earned. Beside her was a man in his early 30s. He had Elias's height and the same broad shoulders, but his eyes were soft. He looked like a man who knew how to listen. "Beverly," I said. "Seraphina," she replied. She didn't look at the soot on my dress. She looked at my eyes. I stepped back to let them in. The foyer of the Northside house was tiny. With 7 people now inside, it felt like a pressure cooker. I led Beverly and her son into the living room. Evelyn stood up from the kitchen table, her hands trembling. She walked into the living room and stopped, staring at the young man. "Elias?" she whispered. "No, ma'am," the young man said, his voice deep and kind. "I'm E.J. Elias, Jr. You must be my grandmother." Evelyn let out a sob, a sound of 30 years of repressed grief finally breaking through. She reached out, and E.J. caught her, pulling the small, frail woman into a hug that looked like a homecoming. Beverly watched them, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to me. "I saw the fire on the news as we were driving in," she said. "The Carter estate. It's gone." "It was a house of cards, Beverly," I said. "It was time for it to burn." "I'm not here to take anything from you, Seraphina," Beverly said, her voice steady. "I know what people will think. The first wife coming for the spoils. But I've made my own way. I have a pension. I have a home. I only came because when you called, I heard the truth in your voice, and I wanted my son to see the man who abandoned him just once before the world finishes him off." "He's at the side of the fire," I said. "Or he's in the back of a police car. Either way, he's finished." I looked at EJ. He was still holding Evelyn. He looked over her shoulder at my children, Naomi and Marcus. There was a moment of profound, awkward tension. These were siblings who didn't know each other. They were the casualties of the same war, fought on different fronts. "Hi," Marcus said, stepping forward. He held out his hand. "I'm Marcus. I'm your brother, I guess." EJ let go of Evelyn and took Marcus's hand. The grip was firm. "I've heard of you. The Vice President of Operations. You've done a lot for the city." "I've done a lot for a lie," Marcus said. "But I'm hoping to change that." Naomi stepped forward too, her lawyer's mask finally cracking. "I'm Naomi. I have a lot of questions about Maryland law, EJ, and I have a lot of apologies to make for my father." "You don't owe me anything, Naomi," EJ said. "You didn't know." We sat in the living room, the children on the floor, the women in the chairs. For the next 3 hours we talked, not about money, not about the company. We talked about the 30 years Elias had spent living 2 lives. Beverly told us about the letters she'd sent in the 90s, letters Elias had intercepted and burned. She told us about the private investigator she'd hired in 2005, only to have her life threatened by a man who claimed to represent Carter Logistics. "He threatened you?" I asked, my blood running cold. "He told me that if I ever set foot in Richmond, I'd lose my nursing license," Beverly said. "He knew I was a single mother. He knew my son was my world. He used my fear to keep me in Wilmington." I looked at Diane Sterling. She was taking notes. This wasn't just bigamy and fraud anymore. This was witness intimidation and harassment. "He's going away for a long time, Beverly," Diane said. "A very long time." As the night wore on, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I watched my children talking to EJ. I watched Beverly and Evelyn sharing a photo of my grandmother. I felt a strange sense of peace. The strong Black woman had been a lonely woman. She had been a woman who carried everyone's secrets and everyone's burdens. But here, in this small house, the burdens were shared. The secrets were out. At 2 a.m., the phone rang. It was the landline. I hadn't used it in years. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the receiver. "Hello? Seraphina?" It was Elias. His voice was cracked, barely a whisper. I could hear the background noise of a busy precinct, the clatter of typewriters, the murmur of voices, the slam of a cell door. "The police found me," he said. "I'm at the 2nd precinct. Sterling is here. He's talking about cooperation. Sarah, you have to help me. If you tell them you knew about the funds, if you say it was a joint decision for the family, we can get a plea. We can save the name." I looked out the kitchen window at the rain. "The name is already gone, Elias," I said. "And I'm not Sarah anymore. I'm Seraphina Robinson, and I'm sitting in my grandmother's kitchen with Beverly." There was a sharp, jagged intake of breath on the other end. "Beverly? You brought her there? You're talking to her?" "We're more than talking, Elias. We're comparing notes. And it turns out, 30 years of lies is a very long book." "Sarah, listen to me." "No, Elias. You listen to me. I'm going to the FBI at 8 a.m. I'm giving them the 1994 ledger. I'm giving them the city contracts. And I'm giving them the names of every man you bribed to keep your empire standing. I'm not doing it to save myself. I'm doing it to clear the air so my children can breathe." "You'll destroy them!" he screamed. "They'll be the children of a felon!" "They already are," I said. "But now, they'll also be the children of a woman who had the courage to tell the truth. That's a better legacy than a burning house." "I loved you," he whimpered. "Everything I did for us." "You did it for the man in the portrait, Elias, and he burned tonight." I hung up. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. I thought about the ballroom. I thought about the new Mrs. Carter. I thought about Jada. "Marcus?" I called out. He came into the kitchen. "Yeah, Ma?" "Call the hospital. Find out where they took Jada. She's probably alone, and she's carrying a child who is going to need a family that doesn't lie to him." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. "You're serious?" "I'm done leaving people behind, Marcus. That was your father's way. It's not mine." I walked back into the living room. Beverly looked up at me. "Was that him?" she asked. "Yes." "What did he want?" "He wanted me to save him," I said. "But he forgot that you can only save someone who wants to be found. Elias Carter is still lost in the smoke." I sat down in my grandmother's old armchair. It was worn and faded, but it fit me perfectly. "Beverly," I said, "I think it's time we talked about the future. Not his, ours." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the ash of the Libby Hill estate. The strong black woman was dead. Long live the woman who survived her. The sun rose over Richmond with a pale, indifferent light, filtering through the window of my grandmother's kitchen. I had not slept. I had spent the pre-dawn hours in a ritual of shedding. I took off the midnight blue silk gown, the dress that was supposed to celebrate 30 years of a lie, and I didn't hang it up. I didn't take it to the cleaners. I folded it into a neat, heavy square and placed it in a garbage bag. It felt like burying a version of myself that had finally stopped breathing. I showered until the scent of smoke was gone from my pores. Then I dressed in a charcoal gray wool suit. It was a work suit, unadorned, professional, and sharp. I didn't wear the sapphire necklace. I didn't wear my wedding ring. I wore a simple gold watch my father had given me when I graduated nursing school. At 7:30 a.m., Diane Sterling was back at the door. She looked as tired as I felt, but her eyes were bright with the tactical energy of a woman about to go to war. "The FBI field office is on 4th Street, Diane said, handing me a lukewarm coffee. "Agent Silas Thorne is waiting. He's a straight shooter. He doesn't care about Richmond politics, which makes him the most dangerous man in this city right now." I looked at my children. Marcus and Naomi were standing in the hallway, dressed and ready. They looked like a unified front. Beside them, EJ and Beverly stood quietly. "You don't have to come with me," I told them. "This is my statement, my signature." "Ma," Naomi said, her voice firm, "we've spent our whole lives being part of the Carter brand. We're staying for the Robinson truth." We arrived at the federal building as the city was waking up. The local news crews were already there. Word of the fire at Libby Hill and Elias's arrest had spread like a contagion. The cameras flashed as we walked toward the entrance, but I didn't look at them. I didn't hide my face behind a handbag or a pair of oversized sunglasses. I walked with my chin up, watching the glass doors. Agent Silas Thorne was a man of few words and heavy presence. He led us into a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial cleaner and old paper. He didn't offer us water. He just sat down and opened a digital recorder. "Mrs. Carter, or is it Miss Robinson?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Robinson," I said. "Seraphina Robinson." "Ms. Robinson, you are here voluntarily to provide a statement regarding the financial activities of Carter Logistics and its relationship with the City Redevelopment Fund. You are also here to discuss the matter of Elias Carter's legal status." I didn't wait for him to ask the first question. I opened the 1994 ledger, the one Evelyn had hidden for 3 decades. "This," I said, placing it on the table, "is where it began. With a theft of $142,000 from my father's estate. It was used as the seed money for a company that has, for 30 years, functioned as a sophisticated laundering operation for municipal funds." For the next 4 hours, I spoke. I told him about the management fees that were actually kickbacks. I told him about the Hopewell warehouse where the condemned steel was stored. I told him about the council members who received consulting checks that were never reported. I didn't protect anyone. I didn't hedge. I saw the shock on Thorne's face when I handed over the list of names. Men I had shared Sunday dinners with. Men who had prayed over my children. "You realize," Thorne said, leaning forward, "that by providing this, you are effectively dismantling the leadership of this city. The fallout will be massive. There will be people who view this as an act of betrayal against the community." The community was betrayed the moment they started stealing from the people they were supposed to house, I replied. I am not betraying them. I am simply refusing to be their silence anymore. And the bigamy? Thorne asked. Beverly Ann Vance is in the lobby, I said. She has the 1992 marriage certificate. She also has the records of the intimidation she faced when she tried to contact my husband over the last 20 years. Thorne looked at the ledger, then back at me. Miss Robinson, your cooperation is significant. Given that you were also a victim of the marital fraud, the U.S. Attorney is inclined to view your involvement in the corporate filings as coerced through deception. But there will be civil penalties. The IRS will be coming for the back taxes on every joint return you filed. Let them come, I said. I've already directed my daughter to begin the liquidation of my personal jewelry and the Northside property holdings to cover the initial assessments. I want the city made whole. When we finally walked out of that building at noon, the world felt different. The air was sharper. The weight on my chest hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer the weight of a secret. It was the weight of a task. What now, Ma? Marcus asked as we reached the car. Now, I said, we go to the hospital. Terrence Miller called. Jada is in early labor. The maternity ward at Richmond Memorial was a place of soft colors and quiet whispers, a jarring contrast to the federal building I'd just left. Jada was in a private room at the end of the hall. She was alone. There were no flowers. There was no new Mrs. Carter entourage. There was just a 24-year-old girl, her face pale and sweaty, clutching the rails of a hospital bed while the monitors beeped a steady, lonely rhythm. When I walked in, she flinched. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and shame that made my heart ache in a way I hadn't expected. Seraphina, she wheezed, a contraction making her body go rigid. I didn't tell them everything, I swear. I didn't know about the first wife. I didn't know. I walked to the side of the bed. I didn't say anything at first. I took a washcloth, dipped it in cold water, and wiped the sweat from her forehead. It was the nurse in me, the woman I had been before I became a queen. He's not coming, Jada, I said softly. She let out a sob, her eyes filling with tears. I called his lawyer. He said Elias is focused on his legal defense and that I should contact my own family. My mother won't answer the phone. She told me I made my bed when I ran off with a married man. You did, I said, my voice steady but not unkind. You made a very hard bed, and now you're about to bring a child into it. What am I going to do? She cried, her voice cracking. They're going to take my baby if I go to jail for the hacking. He told me it was just moving money for the nursery. I looked at this girl, this child who had tried to steal my life. I saw the same blindness in her that I had possessed 30 years ago. She had wanted to be seen. She had wanted to be the one who tamed the lion. She hadn't realized that the lion only likes people who are easy to swallow. You're going to give birth, I said, and then you're going to tell the truth to Agent Thorne. If you cooperate, if you show them exactly how Elias instructed you to frame me, the U.S. Attorney will likely give you a suspended sentence. You'll have a record, but you'll have your child. Why are you helping me? She whispered, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I tried to ruin you. I stood in that ballroom and took your place. You didn't take my place, Jada, I said, bringing out the cloth. You took my sentence. And I'm only helping you because that baby deserves to know that even when the foundation is rotten, the people who come after can choose to be better. I stayed with her for 2 hours. I held her hand through the contractions. I didn't do it out of love. I did it out of a sense of ancestral duty. I had been the strong black woman who held everyone up. Now, I was just a woman holding another woman's hand because no one else was there to do it. Before we continue, let me know, would you have stayed with the mistress during labor, or would you have left her to face the consequences of her choices alone? Let me know in the comments. That evening, I did the hardest thing of all. I went to the church. Grace Tabernacle was a sanctuary of red carpet and stained glass, a place where I had spent 3 decades of my life. I was the head of the women's ministry. I was the one who organized the food drives and the scholarship funds. But as I walked into the vestry for the emergency board meeting, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a cornered animal. Deacon Miller was there. Councilman Vance was there. 5 other men, the pillars of the community, were seated around the heavy oak table. They looked at me with eyes that were cold, hard, and full of a quiet, simmering rage. "Seraphina," Deacon Miller said, his voice a low, warning growl. "We heard you went to the FBI today. We heard you gave them names." "I gave them the truth, Deacon," I said, standing at the head of the table. I didn't sit down. I didn't want to be on their level. "The truth?" Councilman Vance spat. "The truth is you're destroying this community. You're taking down the men who have built this city. Who's going to fund the youth programs now? Who's going to keep the lights on in this church? You've betrayed your own people for the sake of a grudge against your husband." "A grudge?" I laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "My husband is a bigamist who stole $4 million from the housing fund. He stole from the very youth programs you're pretending to care about. He bought a mistress a condo with money that was supposed to fix the roofs in the East End, and you all knew. You took your consulting fees, and you looked the other way while our neighbors stayed in condemned houses." "We were doing God's work, Seraphina," Miller said, his hand slamming onto the table. "Sometimes the path to the kingdom requires compromise. We kept the peace. We kept the power in our hands instead of theirs." "Power?" I stepped closer to him. "You don't have power. You have a lease on a lie, and the lease just expired." "You'll never walk in this city again," Vance hissed. "You think you're so righteous? You enjoyed the checks too. You're just as guilty as we are." "Maybe I am," I said, "and that's why I'm the one who's ending it. I've already stepped down as the head of the women's ministry. I've already turned over my personal financial records, and I've already told the FBI about the discretionary fund this board has been using for its private vacations." The room went deathly still. I saw the sweat break out on Miller's upper lip. I saw Vance's hand tremble. "You're a traitor, Seraphina," Miller whispered. "A strong black woman doesn't do this to her own. She holds the line. She protects the family." "I am protecting the family," I said. "The real one. Not the one you built out of kickbacks and silence. I am protecting the women who give their last dime to this church, thinking it's going to the needy. I am protecting the children who deserve leaders who don't steal their futures." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Deacon, the next time you pray for strength, you might want to ask for honesty instead. It's a much lighter load to carry." I walked out of the church. I didn't look back at the stained glass. I didn't look back at the pews where I'd sat for 30 years. As I reached the parking lot, I saw Beverly waiting by my car. She looked at me, her expression soft. "They didn't take it well, did they?" she asked. "No," I said. "They like the matriarch when she's keeping their secrets. They don't like her when she's cleaning the house." "Where are we going now, Seraphina?" I looked at the city, the lights of Richmond twinkling in the distance. The Carter estate was a pile of ash. The Carter Logistics Company was a crime scene. The Carter marriage was a legal ghost. "We're going to the north side," I said. "Evelyn is making tea, and EJ and Marcus are talking about starting a new business, one that actually has a legitimate charter." As we drove away, I felt a strange, fluttering sensation in my chest. It took me a moment to realize what it was. It was a lack of armor. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the strong black woman protecting an empire. I was just Seraphina. But as we pulled onto the highway, my phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I answered it. "Seraphina." It was a woman's voice, cold, cultured, and very, very angry. "This is Regina Vance, Elias's sister. The one you haven't seen in 20 years? The one who lives in Zurich." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Regina was the black sheep of the family, the one who had left the country in the 90s and never looked back. Elias had always spoken of her with a mixture of fear and reverence. "Regina," I said. "You've been very busy, Seraphina," she said. "Destroying my brother, destroying the family name. But you forgot one thing. Elias wasn't the only one who had a stake in that redevelopment fund. And you just cost me a lot of money." "I don't care about your money, Regina." "You will," she whispered. "Because I'm not a politician like Arthur, or a thief like Elias. I'm a Vance, and we don't let the help burn down the house without paying the price. Check your daughter's bank account, Seraphina, and then check your son's. I think you'll find that the truth has a very high interest rate." The line went dead. I looked at Naomi, who was sitting in the passenger seat. "Naomi, check your account, now!" Naomi pulled out her phone. A moment later, she let out a gasp that sounded like a scream. "Ma, it's gone. Everything. The trust funds, the savings, the balances are all zero. There's a note in the transaction history." "What does it say?" Naomi looked at me, her face ghostly white. "The matriarch has no grace for a traitor. Welcome to the north side, Seraphina. I hope you like the view from the bottom." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Elias wasn't the final boss. He was just the distraction. The real power was coming for me, and it was coming from the one place I hadn't looked. The bloodline. The silence in the car was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum. It felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the Mercedes, leaving us gasping in the dark. Naomi stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as if she could somehow wish the numbers back into existence. Marcus, usually the one with the quick temper, was eerily still. He pulled the car onto the shoulder of the road, the hazards clicking with a rhythmic, mocking sound. "How?" Marcus whispered. "Those accounts were private. They were Robinson trusts. I moved them myself." "The Vance clause," Naomi said, her voice trembling with the lawyer's realization of a fatal error. "Ma, do you remember when Elias had us sign those restructuring papers in 2012? The ones Diane mentioned?" I felt a cold stone settle in the pit of my stomach. "I remember." "There was a provision," Naomi continued, her eyes filling with tears. A family sovereignty rider. It stated that in the event of a threat to the family legacy, the senior living Vance descendant, not the spouse, the blood descendant, could exercise emergency custodial control over all subsidiary accounts. We thought it was just a way to keep the board from staging a coup. We didn't know Elias had a sister who was still technically a senior descendant. Regina, I whispered. I looked out the window at the passing lights of the city. For 30 years, I had been the one who read the fine print. I was the one who caught the errors. But in 2012, I had been mourning my mother. I had been tired. And Elias had been so kind. He had brought me tea and told me to trust him. He had used my grief as a blindfold. She's in Zurich, Diane Sterling said from the back seat, her voice tight. Regina Vance didn't just leave Richmond because she hated the humidity. She left because she was the one actually running the offshore side of the redevelopment fund. Elias was the face. Regina was the vault. If she's drained the accounts, she's signaling that she's ready to burn the bridge behind her. She thinks she's winning, I said. I turned to look at my children. They looked terrified. They had gone from being the heirs of an empire to being the victims of a frame-up, and now they were penniless. They were seeing the world without the Carter safety net for the first time. She thinks she's left us with nothing, I said, my voice gaining a sudden sharp edge. But she forgot one thing. She's a Vance. And Vances always leave a paper trail because they're too arrogant to believe anyone will ever be smart enough to follow it. Marcus, drive, I commanded. Where, Ma? Back to the north side. I need to talk to Evelyn. If Regina is the senior descendant, Evelyn is the matriarch. And there is no Vance secret that woman hasn't buried herself. When we walked back into the north side house, the atmosphere had shifted from a wake to a war room. Beverly and EJ were in the kitchen, washing the tea things. They looked up as we burst in, the urgency on our faces clear. Evelyn, I said, walking straight to the living room where she was sitting with her Bible. Tell me about Regina. Evelyn looked up, her faded eyes narrowing. Regina? Why are you asking about that girl? She hasn't set foot in this state since the day she stole her father's watch and caught a flight to London. She just drained the children's accounts, Evelyn. She used a clause in a 2012 filing. She's protecting the Vance legacy from me. Evelyn set her Bible down on the side table. She let out a long, wheezing breath that sounded like a tire losing air. Regina always was the one with the most poison in her veins. Elias is a thief, yes, but he's a clumsy one. He wants to be loved. Regina just wants to be feared. She didn't go to Zurich to work in finance. She went there because she was the one who set up the original shell companies for her father back in the 80s. Her father? I asked, sitting on the ottoman at her feet. Elias's father was a postman. Evelyn let out a dry, bitter laugh. That's the story Elias told you. His father wasn't a postman. His father was the bagman for the Richmond political machine in the 60s. He's the one who taught Regina how to hide money in plain sight. When he died, he didn't leave them a house or a pension. He left them a map of every crooked hole in this city. I looked at Diane. She was already on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. Evelyn, I said, taking her hands. If Regina is using that 2012 clause, she has to be linked to a domestic entity. She can't exercise sovereignty from a Swiss bank account without a local agent. Who would she trust in Richmond? Evelyn's eyes clouded with a distant, painful memory. There was a man, a lawyer, not a fancy one like your Naomi. A man who works out of a basement in the West End. Silas Vane. Silas Vane? Naomi interrupted. Ma, that's Julian Vane's brother, the forensic accountant you hired. The room went deathly silent. I felt a cold shiver of betrayal. I had hired Julian Vane to find the money. I had trusted him with the ledger. I had let him into my home. Julian didn't know, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince them or myself. He's been working with me for months. Or he's been the one feeding Regina every move you made, Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Think about it, Ma. How did she know the exact second to drain the accounts? How did she know we were at the FBI today? Julian was the only one who knew the timeline. I stood up. I felt a sudden searing heat behind my eyes. For 30 years, I had been the strong black woman who was never fooled. I was the one who saw the traps. And yet, I had walked directly into one set by the very man I'd paid to protect me. Diane, I said, can you track the transfer? I'm trying, Diane said, but it's a ghost transaction. It hit a series of intermediary banks in the Caymans and then disappeared. But Marcus is right. The authorization had to come from a local signature. If Silas Vane is the agent, the paper is in his office. Then we go to the West End, I said. Ma, it's 3 a.m., Naomi said. We can't just break into a law office. I'm not breaking in, I said. I'm going to have a conversation with Julian Vane, and he's going to tell me exactly where his brother is hiding the Vance sovereignty documents, or I'm going to make sure the FBI knows that he was an accomplice to the theft of $4 million in municipal funds. We found Julian Vane at his office in a high-rise downtown. He was still there, the lights burning bright in the mahogany-paneled suite. He was staring at a monitor, a glass of bourbon in his hand. When we walked in, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. Seraphina, he said, standing up. I was just about to call you. Save it, Julian, Marcus said, stepping forward. He didn't hit him, but the way he loomed over the desk was enough. Where's the money? Where's your brother? Julian looked at me, and I saw the shame in his eyes. It was a real, visceral thing. I didn't know he was working for her, Seraphina. I swear on my mother's grave. I found the link 10 minutes ago. Silas, he's been the quiet partner for the Vance family for 20 years. He's the one who drafted the 2012 papers. He built a back door into the trust that even I couldn't see. Where is he, Julian? I asked. My voice was like ice. He's at the airport, Julian said, his voice cracking. A private hangar. He has the physical tokens for the offshore accounts. Regina is meeting him in the Bahamas in 6 hours. If he gets on that plane, the money is gone forever. It will be absorbed into a series of trusts that can't be cracked by any court in the world. Call Thorne, I told Diane. No, Julian said, reaching for his coat. If you call the FBI, he'll see them coming. He has the police scanners. He has people on the inside. You need to get there quietly. And you need someone who can bypass the security gates. And why should we trust you? Naomi asked, her eyes narrowed. Because I'm a Vane, Julian said. And I've spent my whole life trying to be better than the man who raised us. My brother is a thief. I'm an accountant. And right now, I'm the only person who can get you onto that tarmac. The drive to the private airfield was a blur of speed and shadow. Julian sat in the passenger seat, directing Marcus through the back roads of Henrico County. We reached the perimeter fence, a high, chain-link barrier topped with concertina wire. Julian pulled a keycard from his wallet. The security company is a subsidiary of my firm. They haven't updated the codes yet. The gate groaned open. We drove onto the tarmac. In the distance, a small, sleek Gulfstream jet was idling, its engines a low, powerful whine. A black town car was parked near the stairs. A man was standing by the car, a silver briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. He was thin, balding, and looked remarkably like Julian. As we pulled up, the man, Silas Vane, froze. He looked at the Mercedes, then at his brother. "Julian?" he shouted over the noise of the engines. "What are you doing here? You should be at the office." Julian stepped out of the car. "It's over, Silas. Give her the briefcase." "Are you crazy?" Silas laughed, a high, panicked sound. "There's $12 million in here, Julian. 6 for her, 6 for us. We can be in Zurich by Tuesday. You don't have to spend your life auditing other people's crimes anymore. You can have your own." I stepped out of the car then. I stood on the tarmac, the wind from the jet engines whipping my charcoal gray hair. I didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. I looked like a woman who was finally collecting a debt. "Silas," I said, "my name is Seraphina Robinson. You might know me as the woman you've been robbing for 30 years. Silas looked at me, then at the suitcase. He moved toward the plane. "Get out of the way, lady. You have no jurisdiction here. This is a private flight. The papers are legal. Regina Vance has the right to these assets." Regina Vance is a bigamous sister who is currently being named in a federal warrant for municipal fraud, I said, stepping closer. "And that briefcase contains the pension funds of 500 shipyard workers. My father was one of them, Silas. You think I'm going to let you walk onto that plane with his sweat and blood in a bag?" "I'll call security." Silas reached for his pocket. "Security is already here," a voice boomed from the shadows of the hangar. Agent Silas Thorne stepped into the light, followed by 6 uniformed federal agents. They didn't have their sirens on. They didn't have their lights flashing. They had been waiting in the dark. "Ma?" Naomi asked, looking at me in shock. "I called Thorne the second we left Julian's office," I said quietly. "I'm done taking chances with family loyalty." Thorne walked up to Silas Vane and held out his hand. "The briefcase, Silas, and the tokens. You're under arrest for interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Silas looked at Julian, his face twisted in a mask of betrayal. "You sold me out. Your own brother." "I didn't sell you out, Silas," Julian said, his voice heavy with a profound sadness. "I just stopped being your shadow." As the agents led Silas Vane away, Thorne turned to me. He held the silver briefcase. "We'll have to hold this as evidence, Miss Robinson. But the digital freeze on your children's accounts will be lifted by morning. The transfer was never finalized." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 30 years. "Thank you, Agent Thorne." "Don't thank me yet," Thorne said, his expression darkening. "We just got a ping from Interpol. Regina Vance wasn't at the airport in Zurich. She boarded a flight to Richmond 4 hours ago. She's not running away, Seraphina. She's coming home." I looked at the jet sitting on the tarmac. The engines were still whining, a sound like a scream. Regina wasn't a scavenger like Elias. She was a hunter. And she was coming to the north side to finish what her brother had started. "Marcus," I said, turning to my son, "call Beverly. Tell her to take Evelyn and EJ to the hotel, the one under Diane's name. What about you, Ma? I'm going back to the house, I said. If Regina wants a conversation with the senior Vance descendant, I'm going to give her one. But first, I'm going to make sure the tea is hot. I looked at the sapphire necklace in my hand. I hadn't put it back on. I looked at the inscription one last time. Truth is a slow fire. The fire was no longer slow. It was ablaze, and I was the only thing left standing in the middle of it. The Northside house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a breath held too long. I had sent the others away. Marcus and Naomi had fought me, their eyes red with exhaustion and fear. But I had used the voice, the one that had commanded surgical theaters and corporate boardrooms for 3 decades. I told them that this wasn't their debt to pay. I told them that Regina Vance wouldn't talk to the help's children. She would only talk to the woman who had worn her family's name like a cloak for 30 years. Beverly had looked at me before she left, a deep, silent understanding passing between us. She knew what it was to face a Vance alone. She had done it for 20 years from a distance. She squeezed my hand, a silent prayer of solidarity, and led Evelyn and EJ to the car. Now, it was just me. I sat at the oak kitchen table. I had replaced the charcoal gray suit jacket with a thick, cream-colored cardigan. I looked like a grandmother. I looked like a woman who was tired of the noise. But on the table in front of me sat 3 things: a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea, the 1994 ledger, and a small digital recorder that was already blinking red. At 4:15 a.m., a car pulled into the narrow driveway. It wasn't the frantic screech of tires that Elias usually favored. It was the smooth, silent arrival of a high-end European sedan. The door chime rang. 2 sharp, elegant notes. I didn't rush to the door. I took a sip of my tea, let the steam warm my face, and then stood up. I walked to the foyer and opened the door. Regina Vance did not look like a fugitive. She looked like an apparition of old-world wealth. She was in her early 50s, wearing a camel hair coat and a silk scarf that probably cost more than the Northside house. Her face was a masterclass in surgical preservation, taut, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of a winter sea. She looked like Elias, but with all the softness and the need for approval surgically removed. "Seraphina," she said. Her voice was melodic, cool, and carried the faint, affected lilt of someone who had spent too much time in Switzerland. "You've aged, not poorly, but visibly." "Stress will do that, Regina," I said, stepping back to let her in. "Especially when you're the only one doing the heavy lifting in a family of thieves. Come in, the tea is hot." She stepped into the small hallway, her eyes flickering over the modest surroundings with a disdain so pure it was almost impressive. She didn't take off her coat. She walked into the kitchen as if she were inspecting a servant's quarters. "My brother always said you were the strong black woman archetype," Regina said, sitting in the chair Marcus had occupied earlier. She didn't touch the tea. "He said you were the one who made him feel like a king. I told him he was a fool. You didn't make him a king. You made him a target. You made the business look too legitimate. You invited too much scrutiny." "And you prefer the shadows," I said, sitting across from her. "I prefer the results," Regina replied. "Silas Vane is a coward, but he's a loyal one. He told me you tried to stage a little coup at the airport. He told me you think you've won because you have a ledger and a few disgruntled councilmen." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "Seraphina, You are playing a game you don't understand. The Vance legacy isn't just a trucking company or a redevelopment fund. It's a network of obligations that stretches from this city to the State House and across the Atlantic. You've poked a hole in the dam, and you think you're a hero. But all you've done is ensure that you'll be the first one drowned when it breaks. Is that why you're here, Regina? To warn me about the weather? I'm here to give you an exit, she said, reaching into her leather clutch and pulling out a single sheet of paper. This is a global release. You sign it, you hand over the 1994 ledger, and you disappear. I'll restore your children's accounts. I'll even give you a modest stipend to live out your days in that little townhouse in Charleston you've been hiding. I felt a chill. She knew about Charleston. And if I don't? Then the FBI won't just find Elias's crimes, Regina said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They'll find yours. I've spent the last 6 hours framing a digital trail that links every management fee directly to your private accounts. I have emails, Seraphina. Emails from your address with your digital signature discussing the Hopewell warehouse and the bribes. By the time I'm done, Elias will be a tragic figure. A man blinded by a greedy, manipulative wife who stole the city blind. I looked at her. I saw the calculation, the absolute lack of empathy. She was the final evolution of the Vance pathology. She didn't just want the money. She wanted the destruction of anyone who dared to claim a piece of it. You think you're the matriarch, I said. You think you're the one holding the strings. I am the one holding the strings, she snapped. I am a Vance. You were just a Robinson who forgot her place. That's where you're wrong, Regina, I said. I reached over and turned the digital recorder toward her. You've been in Zurich too long. You've forgotten how we do things in the North Side. We don't rely on digital signatures. We rely on the word of the women who actually do the work. I stood up and walked to the kitchen door. Evelyn, I called out. The door to the pantry opened. Evelyn stepped out. She wasn't holding a shawl or a Bible. She was holding a small, old-fashioned tape recorder, the kind Elias's father used to use. Regina froze. Her face went from cool composure to a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Mother? What are you doing here? I told you to stay at the hotel. You didn't tell me anything, Regina, Evelyn said, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it. You haven't called me in 10 years, not even when your father died. You only care about me when you need a signature for a trust. Mother, this woman is trying to destroy the family. No, Regina, Evelyn interrupted, walking to the table. You destroyed the family. You and Elias. You took a name that was built on hard work and turned it into a curse. You think I don't know about the Vance Sovereignty Clause? I'm the one who told Silas Vane to draft it in the first place, 30 years ago. Regina's eyes widened. What? I wanted to protect the family from people like you, Evelyn said. I knew what you were becoming. I saw the greed in you when you were 10 years old. I had Silas build a queen's move into the document, a provision that states if the senior descendant is found to be acting against the moral and legal stability of the estate, the matriarch, the actual blood mother, can veto any custodial transfer. Evelyn reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small notarized stamp. I signed the veto 10 minutes ago, Regina, in front of a mobile notary Seraphina called. The money isn't in your accounts. It isn't in Silas Vane's briefcase. It's currently being held in escrow by the State Tax Board, pending a full audit of the redevelopment fund. Regina stood up, her chair screeching against the linoleum. You betrayed your own blood? For her? She isn't her, Regina, Evelyn said, looking at me with a pride that made my eyes sting. She's the woman who took care of me when you were in Zurich. She's the woman who raised my grandchildren while you were hiding money in Switzerland. She is the only Vance I'm proud to know, even if she's taking her own name back. Regina looked at me, and for the first time I saw the fear. It wasn't the fear of prison. It was the fear of being small, of being a woman with no name and no power. You think this is over? Regina hissed at me. I have lawyers in 3 countries. I'll tie you up in litigation for the rest of your life. You'll die in a courtroom, Seraphina. Maybe, I said, but I'll die with a clear conscience, and you'll die in a cell. Agent Thorne is in the driveway, Regina. He's been listening to the digital recorder since you stepped through the door. You just confessed to witness intimidation and evidence tampering on federal property. The front door burst open. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the hallway. Agent Thorne entered the kitchen, followed by 2 other agents. He looked at Regina with the same indifference he'd shown Elias. Regina Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and intimidation of a federal witness. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it this time. As they handcuffed her, Regina didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She just stared at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so deep it felt like a physical heat. You're still nothing, Seraphina, she whispered as they led her out. You're just a widow with a burnt house. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I turned to Evelyn. The old woman looked exhausted, her strength finally failing her. I led her back to the chair and poured her a fresh cup of tea. You okay, Evelyn? I asked. I'm tired, Seraphina, she said. I've been carrying those children for 60 years. I'm ready to put them down. Then put them down, I said. The strong black woman role is officially closed for the season. 6 months later, the Northside house was full of the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. It was Sunday evening, and the table had been extended with 2 extra leaves to accommodate everyone. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. To her right were Marcus and EJ, who had spent the last half year merging their logistics expertise into a new, fully audited company, Robinson Vance Logistics. They had already won their first city contract, a legitimate one, for the new school district. To her left were Naomi and Beverly. Naomi had left her corporate firm and was now working as a public defender, while Beverly was the head nurse at the community clinic I had helped fund with the remains of the Carter settlement. And at the far end of the room, in a small, hand-carved bassinet, sat Elias Vance Carter III, Jada's son. Jada was serving a 2-year sentence in a minimum security facility. We visited her every month. She was studying for her GED and writing letters to her son. She wasn't the new Mrs. Carter anymore. She was just a girl who had finally learned the value of a name she didn't have to steal. I stood in the kitchen, looking at the scene. I was wearing a simple linen dress, no silk, no sapphires. My hair was a natural silver crown. I looked at my hands. They were still busy, but they weren't tired. They were building something that didn't need a foundation of lies. Elias and Regina were in separate federal prisons, their names a cautionary tale in the Richmond headlines. The Libby Hill estate was a park now, a green space for the community, paid for by the restitution funds. I walked into the dining room and sat down next to Naomi. Ma, she said, smiling. You look peaceful. I am, baby, I said. I looked around the table, at the children who were no longer illegitimate, but the architects of their own lives, at the women who had survived the storm, at the family that was built on truth rather than duty. I picked up my glass, water, not champagne, and held it up. To the foundation, I said. To the foundation, they all echoed. I thought back to that night in the ballroom, the silence after the toast, the pregnant mistress in the champagne silk, the man who thought he could replace a queen with a shadow. He had been right about one thing. I was the backbone. But a backbone isn't just something that carries the weight. It's the thing that keeps you standing straight when the weight is finally gone. I took a sip of my water and smiled. The fire had been slow, but the warmth it left behind was finally, beautifully enough.